Greetings everybody around the world, wherever you may be. You're very welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio. This is your host James Swagger, and for the next hour we'll be getting into some fascinating topics. But before I do, you can check out the links for the live shows at capricornradio.com. We also have a new members area there. You can check out the full MP3 archive at capricornmembers.com. I'm introducing a special lifetime membership fee for Capricorn members. This will entitle you to Capricorn radio shows and Capricorn TV interviews. To sign up for the members area, head over to capricornmembers.com, or equally follow the links on capricornradio.com. Don't forget you can also follow the Capricorn Radio YouTube channel, the Capricorn TV YouTube channel, and of course the Capricorn Radio TV Facebook group and Facebook pages. Or you can also follow what I do, James Swagger, in the James Swagger group on Facebook too. I have a super interesting returning guest today, Mr. Gerald Clark, and if you haven't caught out the previous shows of Gerald, please check out the archives. You'll find that on capricornradio.com, and you'll find it also on Gerald Clark's webpage too, geraldclark77.com. You'll find the links there for his books as well, his bio. Of course, he's the author of two books delving into the world of the Anunnaki and their legacy too. First book, Anunnaki of Nibiru, and the second book, Seventh Planet Mercury Rising. And that's what we're getting into today, the Seventh Planet Mercury Rising book. We're doing a featured presentation of Gerald's book on the show, and we're getting into some really deep concepts. And as the show has been developing, so has the depth of what we're getting into. So today, with the gloves are off, and no doubt we're going to get into some super fascinating stuff. So without further delay, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James, my Irish brother. It's so good to be back, having a real dialogue with some real meat.
That it is, Gerald. You know, this is a real dialogue, and we've done some probably heavy-hitting shows, and I'm just glad that it's continuing. I even had a couple of discussions during the week with the show we do, and I don't normally get to do that, Gerald. And I had a couple of private dialogues with the show, and the response that I'm getting, and the information that we're talking about is just super fascinating because it's very current, it's very pertinent to where I want to go in life, what I want to explore. And a lot of people are into this, Gerald, because they don't just want to know about the history. They want to know what it means for them. They want to know what they can do with it. I mean, if we were genetically altered as a slave species, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? If that was the case, Gerald, well then, you know, where does that leave us today? Are we going to evolve, or were we permanently just, you know, made with defects? And all these questions are abound now, Gerald. All these questions are abound, and that's what we're getting into, I guess.
Yeah, well, I you know, it's interesting that process you're describing where someone finds out the truth about their origins, and there's a deconstruction process that kind of goes along with that they have to start from the past, corroborate, and then they start fast forwarding to their lives and how it affects them here and now. And it usually takes some time, but and it's a process I've watched since I've been in this, I don't know, this realm for several years now. I started researching this stuff in 2003 or 2004. And, you know, I was one of those kind of sideline observers, even though I was staying fully engaged in my research, but I couldn't really talk about the stuff and still continue the lifestyle that I was in, especially as an engineer. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it was still goofy information where people didn't even talk about UFOs that much. It had started though. And then, you know, in 2009 with the Ancient Aliens on History Channel coming out and starting to broach some of this material, it started becoming a little more discussable. So
sure, it's a journey of discovery.
In general, this process that somebody goes through when they're exposed to this, and some people have assigned, I don't know, labels to what they call it, and it's kind of telling. And some people call it breaking the God spell in a way because of what was done. So
it's a profound journey of discovery, Gerald, and you see it in people when they get the knowledge and they can't deny it anymore, and then they go, oh, and the awareness comes after that and what it all means. It is a profound journey of discovery. I guess that's what leads us into the topics for today's show. I mean, last time we got into the Igigi, the miners, the awareness. Did they have awareness? Did they get triggered with mechanisms for ascension, or, Ningishida, the geneticist, to fix the problem? These are all great questions and great explorations of the details of the legacy of what we've been left with this information. Let's get right into it, Gerald. Let's continue on that. What is the composition of man? What are we made of today? Where are we coming from? What do we know about ourselves from this history of the Anunnaki and the legacy that's been left to us?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because this chapter that we're discussing, chapter 3 out of my new book, The Seventh Planet, is really a synthesis of my pragmatic experience, where science hasn't really caught up with some of the exploratory realms, and people who are playing with higher energy through auric fields, through meditations, things like that, versus, what we could measure. So I think both of those come out in this chapter, which is kind of the best we can do with where we're at least where I was at the time that I had this information. So when we talk about the composition of man, that's probably a topic that I started thinking about when I was 13 or 14, and I was in sports, right? So I was playing football, running track, and playing baseball, pretty typical sports. And I noticed that in competing on the field, that there were certain athletes that were more inspired, more capable, more whatever than others, and they were the stars, right? And so, being any typical kid is like, well, it's like looking at an animal that has a capability that you don't have. Go, well, what do I have to do to be able to operate that way? So I started looking at people on the chessboard of life more in terms of these entities that had certain energy, and usually where there was this bigger than life energy, there was a being who had, yes, a big ego, but oftentimes just an auric field that was overwhelming. They'd light up a room they walk in. And then I started thinking to myself about this: what is the place where energy and matter intersect, and how do we characterize this? And it was a question I was asking myself as a young athlete, and I never really quite got an answer, but that was still in the background of my mind when I was thinking about the composition of man. And this came to a head for me, this distinction between energy and matter, when I was just graduating from my structural integration training in Kauai that was taught by the Guild for Structural Integration based out of Boulder. And so I was doing the final 2 phases of my holistic healthcare practice training to become a structural integrator for my kid JJ, really not to open a practice, but I just wanted this knowledge that we discussed previously. Sure. Anyway, so in this process, I was sitting in my room looking out over a lagoon in Kauai, and it was a really deeply spiritual setting on the property where the kahunas used to go to receive their healing, in terms of the energy from the acoustics of how the hills shaped the sound of the ocean coming in, to the waterfalls that were endemic on this 27-acre property. Okay, I mean, it was amazing, and you could actually see from Kahuna Springs, you could see Makaleha, one of the high peaks where there were 4 waterfalls coming down while you're in a classroom setting on this property. It was absolutely stellar place to learn about the human energy. Anyway, so I'm sitting here looking out over this lagoon, surrounded by bamboo and frogs chirping and all these frequency interactions going on. And I'm thinking to myself, and I got to write a graduation paper for this class, right? And it's coming up. So I'm asking myself, and the reason I'm asking myself about the composition of man and the difference between energy and matter at a really heavy introspective level at this point in my path, was because something was changing in my body, and I was experiencing different sensations that were foreign to me, that I could not explain scientifically. And so because of this structural integration process where I'd gone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, to learn this practice, I had been exposed to quite a bit of the work in a very short period of time. For those who know about structure work, when you first start Rolfing, I had 10 series in a very short period of time, probably within a year and a half. And that's a lot of structural stirring up in a short period of time. Well, while I'm in this state and I'm about to graduate this course, I'm staring out thinking, how am I going to discuss human energy? Because that's what I want to talk about as an electrical engineer. That's what was on my mind, in writing this paper. And there weren't many guidelines that limited your ability to choose whatever topic you wanted, which was really nice. So, and of course I wanted to relate it to what I'd just been through this course. So I chose a topic called structure, its function, and energy to try to explain where energy meets matter, and with the best understanding, scientific and pragmatic, that I had at the time. And the real thing I was focused on mostly in explaining was not so much the human energy body itself, even though I detailed it in the paper. I was really focused on truly trying to understand what gravity was at that time. Because I realized that gravity was such a significant force. We encounter it every day. Nobody really pays attention to it that much, except for trying to avert things from falling from one height to a lower height and breaking glasses. They're not really paying attention to how it's affecting their bodies. Well, structural integration was all about that. And one of the hidden magical pieces of this was all of a sudden I was having an experience that was different energetically in my body, my temple, such that when I was exposed to sunlight or water or various stimuli, I was having just a profound experience, which I had not had before, just, a short time ago. Wow. So I'm like, what's different? What's going on? And I was feeling some really amazing sensations to try to explain. So ultimately, and my quest was to understand where energy meets matter and what that place is. And clearly it's in our body for us. Okay. The most important real estate on the planet is your body. It's your interface to the infinite. So from that standpoint, when we start talking about the composition of man, first of all, you got to start from energy and describe what this is that animates one sports, player on the chess game to have more energy, more capabilities, more whatever than another one, and a lot of it comes from when you're young like that and you don't have the mental constructs to put together, a way of thinking. You haven't been trained, to visualize your performance like Olympic athletes are. I mean, it's just natural. It was just natural, raw talent / structure all together that would produce whatever landed on an elementary or junior high school football field, right?
Sure.
So I was thinking deeply about where energy meets matter, and so I ended up, it's a bullet point later on in our discussion where I talk about the human energy equation. So we'll get to that when we get there. But so this composition of man. So what are we, and what models do we have to represent ourselves? Now I didn't share this one with you, but while we're on the idea of structure work, there are lines and planes in the body that basically, if they're understood and how they relate to the vertical field of gravity, we come up with a pretty simple way to measure a human relative to this field and go, well, is man this material form that's being beaten down by this force and ends up, all his structural components going wide, and so one thing I want to bring up is in the composition of man, there's something very malleable about the human form. And I'll give you some examples. Number one, think about a woman who has a baby. She starts out, with a normal abdominal section. And all of a sudden, it can grow to the size of a basketball. Sure. And then produce a baby, which stretches various organs to allow this to occur. And then, with some minor side effects, the body goes back to the way it was before this huge change happened in a 9-month period. Now, the other extreme is people who gain a lot of weight, and then lose a lot of weight. You can see that the body can be made various forms. Then there's the extreme muscle building community that's doing bodybuilding. Oh yeah. So the idea of transforming this matter we call man or woman into its various forms that it can take on has quite a range, quite a broad range. Sure. Okay. Well, one of the key elements of that is there's malleability there. Interesting outlook, Gerald. Structure, in our tissue. So what is that? Well, structure work went into this very deeply, and I wasn't so concerned about the anatomy and physiology as I was figuring out what they knew that I could learn and do this and help my kid who had really bad issues with his connective tissue. And this is how I started. So let's talk about the structure of the body from that standpoint. And I'll give you some neat models that we used, in addition to the ones that came from the Emerald Tablets, from Drunvalo, and other sources, okay? But this one was pragmatic for me, and I tried this hat on, and it truly fits, okay? Mm-hmm. So what do we know about the composition of man relative to the structural integration model? Well, from that standpoint, gravity is everything. And so this strong force field that shows up in my equation 5 is the figure of merit to align to. Okay, let's just start with that. So the whole concept is to take the body and align it to this infinite force field we call gravity. Well, how is that done? You just posture, stand up straight, and push your shoulders back, and you're good to go? Not hardly. The reality is by the time you're 6 years old, with no knowledge of how to integrate with the gravity field because you were never taught, you can't sit up straight, and your structure is already so deviated that without intervention with structural integration, you will grow into that pattern, and it's going to be with you for life. That's the reality. And that's so when we're talking about the composition of man, this hidden knowledge about how the body works was abominable to me once I realized that there's true freedom in the body if you just know how it works. Mm-hmm. Okay, and a lot of it has to do with this concept of gravity in the structural integration domain, referencing gravity as the therapist. Well, that's kind of a great deference to some infinite force, but the reality is, if you think about that from a scientific standpoint, what is this field of gravity doing with your energy body? And that's why I ended up with my equation in the first book, where I derived it for people, and then the second book, I showed it and then described it in natural language so that there wasn't, lambda, nu, and all these Greek symbols for people that were turned off by that kind of math. And it was pretty simple math. But anyway.
I think that's what differentiates you, Gerald, from other Anunnaki authors. And I know you've evolved into the second book to bring this into human terms of what it means for us as well. But like I say, some people just focus on the genetics of the Anunnaki and that they engineered this, and they don't go into the depth of it. They just mention it. They regurgitate it. But Gerald, you do something different. You talk about this in terms of human energy, frequencies, consciousness, and the chakras, and you apply your electrical engineering background to talk about wavelengths. And we touched a little bit on that last time, but it's a wonderful, well-rounded, insightful perspective, Gerald.
It is a kind of goofy perspective that I ended up with, and that I was brave enough to not worry about someone judging me and try things that I couldn't explain scientifically. So I broke the scientific method in exploring alternative human energy and consciousness and all these areas that were of interest to me, in my truth-seeking path, while at the same time I could back up, put on my scientific hat, scrutinize what I had done, and try to explain it in terms scientifically that the world would accept, because everybody's so left-brained. They haven't caught up with this ancient knowledge of what we used to know about our body. So there was one other thing, a special thing I wanted to throw in about structure work. I launched into learning these techniques, being exposed to it during a triathlon, which I think I told the story before, in order to find a way to deal with what was happening in my kid, JJ. And he was in braces. He was about 5 years old, and he was having trouble walking. Well, there was some genetic side effect from his syndrome caused his connective tissue to droop on his body. It was very loose. So much so it looked like he had big socks on around his ankles where it drifted down and was covering his feet. And his ankles were almost indistinguishable at the talocrural joint, right where his ankle was. So I'm like, what's going on with it, with this? And that's when I discovered that Ida Rolf had been probing into, the founder of structural integration. She'd been probing into this same issue of malleability of tissue for her kid who had polio. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I got the same kind of issue with my kid, because if whatever's going on with his connective tissue, if that wasn't happening, we wouldn't have these braces that go in underneath his shoes and all this crap, making him walk like a robot. It looked ridiculous. And it was really not comfortable for him. And with a special needs child that can't communicate with you verbally, you always ask yourself, are they in pain? Are they comfortable? And watching for the somatic signals from them. So you end up with a very somatic relationship with a child. So the idea that structure work was such a somatic connection to a being through their energy body and a hands-on methodology and all that is really very, very, a profound relationship with a client in the first place. So, So let's go back to what I found out about special needs children and in general for all people relative to the composition of man and this primitive knowledge. What I discovered in my practice that lasted well over 10 years that JJ, my son, launched me into, I discovered that there's a primitive intelligence in all beings. And that primitive intelligence, once accessed, awoken, stirred, and I can explain how that's done through structure work, has the ability, like a radio receiver, to tune in the gravity field and readjust the stacked segments of the human body and relate them to gravity such that you're not in pain. Okay, most people, 95% of people have back problems. And you have to ask yourself, did our creator make a mistake in composing our structure such that we can't integrate with gravity? Because it's a big problem. Because when you see that it's one of the variables in composing your human energy body in equation 5A in my book, you realize, hey, I can't ignore gravity. How does it affect me? And then here's a model I want to give you. So if we know that gravity operates vertically relative to the surface of the Earth all the way down to the core, it's represented as an orthogonal right angle vector, if you're standing there. So now let's think about that. If we take a broom pole that's long enough and you put it on your index finger and stand it up vertically, you realize that with little effort, once you've been practiced it a few times, you can balance that long pole on your finger with just little tiny, I don't know, almost like circadian movements of your hand with very little effort. Okay, but as soon as that pole starts falling over a little bit and you lose control of it, gravity's got control of it, and now it's going to fall, right? Well, in that same model, imagine your body is that broom pole, okay, and you're standing vertically in the gravity field, negating the excessive efforts that you need in your body to counteract this force in order to stabilize yourself in it, versus balancing like a pole in it, and now something magical happens at that place, and this is what Ida Rolf discovered, okay? That place where you find this vertical line and integrate your finite matter with this infinite force is one of the most profound experiences a human will ever have. And the fact that that ability to find that vertical line exists even in special needs children that are severely mentally retarded warmed my heart and made me realize whoever created us did a very special thing for us. And the fact that that has been hidden from man and that only a few small percentage of people and seekers, usually athletes and people that are in yoga and things like that, discover structural integration. Only those people know this, and they know it pragmatically. I think I was one of the first people to take that pragmatic process that was happening and put that to an equation. Okay, so
how big a role does yoga?
Very, very.
How big a role does yoga play with this posture and this exploration of the gravity field on the body?
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I was thinking about that today. So in the East, yoga is done as a lifestyle. They know that about these energy fields. They're trying to improve the energy in their chakras by learning to balance and all these other things that they do relating to the gravity field. Okay, they don't realize that these asanas, truly, if you think about it from an energy standpoint, get them to the place where they can sit in a posture, sits bones engaged on the ground, lumbar's not hurting, head stacked on top, and they can sit in a meditative state all day. Well, how many people do you know that can sit in a position like that on the floor without being, oh, my back hurts, or something goes wrong within 10 minutes, okay? That's the reality. So in yoga in the West, and I participated in this as well, and the reason I started yoga, I have to tell you the story. Once I'd had my first Structural Integration 10 series, my body started changing, and I ended up seeking out a more organized way to stretch, and I naturally found yoga because they had a book with some pictures. Do this stretch. This was, and as a athlete a priori, I'd spent over 17 years in the gym. I was a really hardcore gym rat. I mean hardcore.
Sure.
Actually, I don't know where that energy came from in me, but I would spend hours back and bis, chest and tris, legs, cardio. I mean, I was in such good shape when I was in the military that they made me the master fitness trainer, and that just gave me another excuse to be in there even more. So I really liked the transformative ability to do something to your body, break it down, it recovers, and then gets stronger. I thought that was a neat thing. Okay. So anyway, let's see. So back to the composition of man. There's another model I want to give you that I discovered in this path as well that really helped me understand how to relate to gravity better. And I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but this,
it's important.
And Kristen, I agree. This area of knowledge about the handbook of how you operate in the simulator, sitting, standing, walking, understanding what gravity is and how to have it help you, not beat you down. Okay, there's a war always with gravity, and if you don't understand it, it always wins. Go look at anybody's posture at their C7 that's unaware of gravity after 50 years on this planet, and I guarantee you gravity won. Kyphotic humps, all kinds of deviations, subluxations, rotated vertebra, all that happens because the connective tissue gets hard with aging. It's a natural thing. So in yoga, there's 4 things that change the connective tissue. I'm just going to lay it out there right now, okay, for people that don't know. And they can be done in combination so that there's a more amplified effect. Number 1, there's pressure. Number 2 is tension. Number 3 is temperature, and number 4 is frequency. Okay, so in structural integration, they generally use 3 of the 4. Usually, they make sure the body is a good temperature, such that the fascia, the connective tissue, is warm. Why? Because it's more malleable. Then ask anybody who lives in Detroit versus somebody who lives in Tucson how their body feels in the winter. Okay, when you're in a warm environment, your connective tissue is more malleable. Pressure can be used to change the state of material. Now think about collagen. It's basically protein strands put together in various forms. When you need a ligament, they're woven together like a rope. When you need something that's cartilaginous that can be mobile without breaking, you create something like a nose or an ear. Okay, but it's all made from the same material. Okay, this connective tissue is analogous to slicing open an orange. Inside an orange, you have the meat of the orange, but it's surrounded by the white material that gives those sacs its structure. Well, your connective tissue in your body is exactly the same as that. It gives your body its form and its structure. So here's a model I want to share with people relative to that. And a good friend of mine in Hawaii actually built one of these out of popsicle sticks and rubber bands. It was a funny model we used to call a human. And it's analogous to a suspension bridge, and it's called the tensegrity model. So in that model, imagine you replaced all the bones in the body with sticks, and all the muscles and connective tissues with rubber bands. Okay. So now all of a sudden, if you did that, you'd realize that there are suspension points on the body, much like like the Golden Gate Bridge, where you have high points that have attachments that allow the body to stand in the gravity field if it's properly free enough to do so. So in this tensegrity model, this 3D model, you can imagine rubber bands and popsicle sticks at birth. You know, you come out of the womb in having been in a kind of a folded up position, and now all of a sudden your structure's got to experience the simulator and unwind and adapt to this gravity field. This is an SI model. Okay, so in that case, we know that for some reason, and nobody really knows why, it might be a design flaw, the connective tissue in humans is able to attach and to itself, to bones, to everything else, and it's very deviated at birth. Your rubber bands are glued at places at birth along those popsicle sticks, and they're not symmetrical bilaterally along your mid-sagittal plane or horizontally from the pelvis up or down. Okay, so basically, Ida Rolf, and it's not meant to be a derogatory term, she referred to anybody who has not had structure work as a random body, and she's absolutely right. And I've had my hands on hundreds and hundreds of clients and gone through this process with them. And I can assure you, her research and her work is correct. Okay, and I've seen it, so I have lots of corroborating data. So what I want you to think about when we're talking about this composition of man, this one to me really ought to be illuminated. And I harp on this on the books, all the books in the research. get some structure work, get your antenna right if you want to experience a higher dimension of consciousness. Okay. And a lot of people want to know that because they realize that the more aware you are, and power, information is power, you can only be aware of what you're conscious of. And the higher consciousness you have, we talked about last time, the more scope of accessibility you have to address these kind of things. And and the same is true with all these things that are happening in the realm of this new great year. That a lot of people are waking up to new things that they never even thought about 10 years ago. Lots of things.
Sure. I know we talked a lot on the physical body there, Gerald, and last show we talked about awareness and how that may be enhanced through ascension, and we may have evolved in the last 5,000 years. We may have been triggered. So just tie this all together with the physical, the astral, and the mental, Gerald.
Yeah.
Let's
so
try
in
the
chapter
3 aspects.
3, from the Emerald Tablets, Thoth gives us a model as he's talking about the composition of man, which I thought was a good title to start bringing in both the pragmatic and the different models that various practices have. The Hindus have the chakra model and so on and so forth. So in the book, I talk about these 3 aspects that come from Thoth in his Emerald Tablets. And he talks about having a threefold composition, which is a subset of 9 total elements, as above, so below. These are physical, astral, and mental. Mm-hmm. So in the physical, he talks about magnetism traveling through nerve ganglia and pathways to provide this energy for cells and tissues. So the idea of magnetism is so important, and I never really thought about how important that was. Think about recording media, like the old 8-track tapes, and everything used to use magnetism and a head that was underneath there, and it rubbed this tape across there that had a ferromagnetic field on it that could be changed by the electrical stimulus along this little head, Mm-hmm. So, and then it got to the place where we realized that energy could be captured in flash devices using an understanding of how energy is interacting with material forms. The lock a 1 or a 0 into a little tiny cell, right? So then I started thinking about, this magnetism relative to birds that migrate and marine mammals that are whales and dolphins that are sensitive to the magnetic field, which actually is quite subtle. If you pull a compass out, you'll see, this is not a real strong field. It's just enough to get a little, and you got to have the needle really small and balanced for it to actually respond to this field, right? Well, so that sensitivity in that compass has to be at least as sensitive in a bird or a dolphin or a whale that's navigating using magnetism. So the idea of magnetism and its effect on memory is an area that Drunvalo touches on in his book. Imagine the magnetic field of the Earth suddenly disappeared. What would happen to human memory? Is there some relationship there? And according to Thoth, there is some relationship where he's talking about magnetism operating through the nerve ganglia. Okay, these are your chakras. So that's pretty profound. He mentions one other field that I found interesting. In my human antenna model, and I had derived my human antenna model in this structure as function and energy paper back in 2004 when I wrote it. And I think I don't know if I had read the Emerald Tablets by that point in my life. I don't think I had, actually. Sure. Very shortly thereafter, I did go to a conference on sacred geometry where I had read the Emerald Tablets, but it was after I did Drunvalo's Flower of Life, Volume 1 and Volume 2 book, and then the workshop, okay? So anyway, this idea that Thoth introduces us to is this other subtle energy field that flows through the skeletal structure, and he calls it the Akasa field. So now imagine your ribs are kind of like antennas, and they're receiving some energy and possibly getting to your central conductor along your spine, your spinal cord, okay? Which actually, from the chakra tradition, they call the Sushumna. You have the Ida Pingala, the Ida Nadi and the Pingala Nadi. So these are the energy pathways up and down, relative side in parallel with your central spine, your conductor. And that central spine conductor is the one that shows up in the Caduceus that I know we're going to talk about. Okay, so
the mag tape that you were referring to, Gerald. Just on a point of noting, it used to be. I don't know where you'd get a copy of mag tape now to do this test, but it used to be if you had a brand new tape and you pressed record. Let's say you went into a house on your own in the middle of nowhere, you could pick up voices being recorded on that, echoes and voices.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess a lot of these ghost chasers and stuff take highly sensitive
That's why
instruments
they
and
had
try and
magnetic tape,
pick up magnetic anomalies. Listen, submarines do it too. You know, they send out signals to detect magnetic anomalies to see if some large metal opposing forces out there, you know, pretending to be a whale. So, you know, and actually they can do this from space now, from what I understand. Pick up magnetic anomalies. They analyze the changing magnetic flux of the Earth from space, and you can actually see that the magnetic field on the Earth is changing locations, which is quite interesting. As a pilot, we used to have to take your compass and go, and you'd have the declination on the map that you needed to program as an offset into your compass, so that it would take into account where you were relative to the north. Okay, and each it was adjustable. So now all of a sudden you see them renumbering runways because it's changed so much. That's crazy. Because all these aircraft, you know, if they only have primitive navigation, it's probably an old compass in there that's, you know, in some sort of stabilizing fluid. So you know, if the gravity field's moving around, it can really throw visual flight navigation into a tailspin. And that reminds me of what happened to Admiral Byrd. That happened to him.
Sure. You know, I had a conversation today, which is ironic because I was talking about astrology and it's the effect of electromagnetic energy and a planetary effect that you talked about before. But I was having a discussion with my other half, and I was explaining that the birds start singing at that time of the morning, like 4 a.m., 5 a.m., because it's the biggest, most significant change in the Earth's magnetic field, and it switches on the magnetite in the brains of the birds, and that's how they all fly north-south with this magnetite. And I often wake up at about that time. If I haven't been sleeping, I'll wake up at about 4 a.m. It's like at 3:37 a.m. I always wake up in the summertime, because that's when the magnetic field's coming online. And I have these. It's just like somebody has just turned on the light in my head, and I wake up and I have these epiphanies. I have these moments of clarity, and perhaps maybe my memory gets switched on and activated then, Gerald. I'm totally open to that whole thing. I think that's maybe a lot of people will be aware of that. They call it the eureka moment when, you know, you wake up in the middle of the night because of the magnetic field's changing and it's coming back online as the sun's rising.
That could be totally true. That could totally be true. Hey, I wanted to share a little bit more with you from this section on the composition of man. I was just looking through the book here to remind myself what I said, and something interesting jumped out at me. This is on page 98, by the way, for one of the editions of my book. This is the first one. It says, mastering the elements allows the secret of life in the body, and I put in parentheses Ba, and I want to talk about that a little. To be activated, enabling one to choose to relinquish the body only when the mission is accomplished on Earth. So in other words, the implication is from the Emerald Tablets is, if you energetically get your antenna awake and your chakras aligned and achieve equation 5A to the best you can, and your pineal gland starts firing and you have the wings of Hermes experience, guess what? He's telling you, you have the ability at that point, your Ba energy, and he differentiates between the Ka and the Ba, and I think we're going to talk about that later.
Yeah, let's go into
it shows up all through the Emerald Tablets, but this is another representation of the human energy body, okay? That says it can be activated. Well, what my experience pragmatically is, and most structural integrators will not tell you this, or they can't say things without making health claims, okay? There's a lot of hidden stuff that goes on in the structure community relative to energy and matter that never gets talked about outside of that community. So I hope I'm not stepping on any toes. But the reality is, in my experience, if somebody did even a first series structural integration session with me, and it's usually done in 5 weeks, 2 sessions a week, okay, to do the first recipe that everybody does before you get to the more advanced stuff, okay? And advanced to one person's not the same as advanced to others, okay? So everybody tries to come up with their recipes to put their arms around this profound process. But the reality is, it's all about gravity. Anyway, so this statement he makes here, that if you activate your energy in your body, that basically you become eternal, and you can choose to get rid of your avatar body and take on another one whenever you want. Well, this is how he operated all through the Emerald Tablets and all his incarnations that he talks about. Okay, was this knowledge, this secret knowledge, to distinguish between energy and matter as it relates to you, not in CERN, not out in space, in your temple. It's so important. So I really cued in on this because, like I said, pragmatically, this became so important to me because it was changing my consciousness. It wasn't just an equation. It was really happening to me.
Sure.
And I was willing to play the gravity game to make this go to the maximal extent it could because I had that knowledge. Okay, and I try to share that with everyone. Anyway, once we got past this first composition of man, the second one he posits in the Emerald Tablets is this astral energy. And I find this really interesting as related to some of the stuff we'll talk about in my experience having out-of-body experiences. This astral energy, he says, has three elements. Okay? It's a mediator between the above and the below. Well, that's interesting. So what's above and below? Well, we'll talk about the idea of us living in a holographic simulator that has a clamp. There is a door that differentiates between the above and below. And it turns out that's kind of analogous to what we knew about the Van Allen belts, which we just had a new discovery on. So that's really interesting. So this mediator between above and below. So in people that are familiar with out-of-body experiences, I think they would understand that. Non-spiritual. And this is interesting to me to differentiate between spirit and energy. And I oftentimes use those terms interchangeably, and sometimes I get rebuked for it. But in my mind, I think I'm still mostly correct. Now, the special nature of the energy never gets discussed about, well, what's this energy on this frequency versus that one? So you can say, spirit, but to me, when I hear that, I always hear energy. And maybe because I'm an electrical engineer, I don't know, but I have not had anybody dissuade me from still thinking that way.
Yeah. I would be the same. I would interchange them as well, depending on the day, depending on the day in question for me.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So in this non-spiritual, I introduced the idea of this Merkaba meditation that came from Drunvalo's teachings. Well, this meditation is ancient, and it contains two words, the ka and the ba. Well, it turns out those two words show up all through the Emerald Tablets. One represents the illusionary energy of transient matter that mankind signs up to and runs down on Black Friday to get as much as they can from Walmart, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the illusion of ka, this transient matter illusion that keeps people enslaved. And when this activation energy that was talked about, and the secret, when you master the elements, what are the elements that we have to master? I'll tell you the one that's beating you on the head that you're ignoring is gravity. Sure. Don't ignore that one. If you master that one, guess what? It's got magic all of its own. And I want to say one more thing about that I didn't feel like I fully put a fork in it. When you stir up the body using those four principles, make it malleable so that the sticks and rubber bands can get loose and line to the gravity field, guess what happens? Not only do your chakras light up like an evolutionary freight train, but that process that you trigger and the malleability of that body, if you keep doing yoga and paying attention to where your bowling ball size head is on top of your shoulders, is your ear right over your shoulder, you're letting it fall forward. If you just play the game and pretend like gravity matters, guess what'll happen? Your body will continue to adapt to it the rest of your life. Little distinguishments, up and down. It's amazing. Every day you get up, there's something different because you've been out of the gravity field, like you said, with magnetism, with the sun coming up. Well, it's the same with gravity. You stay out of the field overnight where you're sleeping, stand back up in it. Well, guess what? Now your whole broom pole gets an opportunity to be vertical in that field once again, right? And all the rubber bands and popsicle sticks are going to adjust to whatever pattern that you had that you thought was in proper relation to that. Some people think of it as their posture, okay? And it's a vanity thing, but it's not. Okay.
Can you get into energy. Some the Merkaba meditation, Gerald? Can you talk about that? The 17 breaths.
Sure. Yeah. And it's been around for a while. And I think Drunvalo and others who have done the recording of the meditation did a great job. So I don't want to step on any toes, and it's all their material, but it's been around a long time, and it's affiliated with the Flower of Life symbol that he discloses got him involved in this in the first place. Mm-hmm. That symbol relationally shows lots of processes that are circular, kind of like the aurora borealis, from a cellular level, from a seed to a plant to a fruit to a seed, and in circular rejuvenation process. Okay, that's what the Flower of Life represents. Well, when you find out that Thoth was all about this process and teaching in his mystery schools, it makes a lot more sense. So we want to talk about the Merkaba real quick. So in that process of activating various energy fields in your body, there's a meditation that allows you to do that, and it's called the Merkaba, and it's only 17 or 18 breaths, depending on the last breath or where you are in your process. Okay. So, generally I used to, let's talk about what it is and how it works and and why it works. And then we can probably go through and segment it if you want. I memorized it because I've done it so many times. Okay.
Sure.
And, so the idea is that the Merkaba field is a star tetrahedron type structure. And you can look up what a star tetrahedron is. It's kind of like a 3-dimensional pyramid going up and one going down, and they overlap each other.
Sure.
Okay. So it's like a triangle going up and a triangle coming down. It makes that 6-pointed star you see on the Israeli flag. Well, imagine that's 3-dimensional. And you do that.
It's like a 3-dimensional Israeli flag symbol. Yeah.
Right.
I got you.
Well, what's interesting to me is that structure shows up in a new field of study. And I think, Richard Hoagland discussed it in his book, Dark History of NASA. I think I might have got the
I think
title
Nassim
wrong.
Haramein.
Anyway, there's an idea of a spinning planet that has an equator, and that certain torsional effects show up based on how it's rotating. Taking account angular momentum and the density of the planet.
I think the best example of that, Gerald, is Jupiter's spot occurs at the 19.5 degree star tetrahedron.
Exactly. So right at the 19.5 location is where one of the planes of the star tetrahedron crosses, and they realize the energy that's coming out of the poles of these planets is forming various geometries depending on whether you're on the north or south side of how it's rotating. And this came out
the hexagon,
one of them, it kind of makes a CSI on the bottom, and the top it makes a pentagon.
Yeah, there's a hexagon on Saturn. Saturn's the probably best example, I think, but there's a hexagon.
Yeah. So anyway, the idea that this is going on in planets, and thinking about as above, so below, as we're taught in the Merkaba, that energy that represents the planet is the same energy that's in a microcosm in the same shape in your body. Okay. So when I talk about the twin flames coming together, think about the top pyramid that's pointing down, it represents the male energy, and the one from the bottom going up represents the female. Okay. Well, when those two join together, it creates the archetype of the Magus card, which is in the Tarot teaching, and it turns out to be none other than Thoth, who was represented as a hermaphrodite. He had both male and female energy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this male and female energy are represented by these star tetrahedrons. If you go through this meditation, essentially what you're attempting to do, without walking through it, is visualize your energy relative to this male and female energy. There's a little bit of a clearing process. You play with your breath just slightly. It's nothing major. And then about the 14th breath, you prepare yourself and you activate visualizing this spinning Merkaba field, just like it would be, as the torsion field effect physics show, it happens in planets. So you visualize this process, and essentially through this meditation, you activate your Ba field. And this is the key field that Thoth talks about, and we don't want to get too far ahead, that's essentially break the illusion of Ka. Once you activate that field in your body, you're not going to be caught up in the desires of materialism anymore, because you're going to be focused on more permanent things by design. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, this whole idea of being caught up in this illusion of Ka has some deep legs from the electromagnetic spectrum standpoint. Thinking about our design, how they designed us to interact with the electromagnetic spectrum, and the theory is put forward by Drumvallo, as he was told by Thoth, he in his book, that there is a false Merkaba field that was set up to keep humans in their enslavement state. Wow. Okay, so all of a sudden you realize, it's not just the fluoride and all the other things to shut the pineal gland down, but it's, that we're dealing with electromagnetic beatdown that is quite serious, that is designed to keep you from waking up.
These are some serious control mechanisms in place for us noisy humans, Gerald.
Yeah. They are noisy. So anyway. The 17th breath meditation, I used to do it every 24 hours until I felt like this field wasn't going to turn off and go away anymore. And I find that once you do that after some period of weeks, all of a sudden it's on, and that's it. It does make you very sensitive to other people's energy, though. Mm-hmm. This Merkaba field, according to Drumvallo, and I haven't physically measured it as a scientist, he says it extends out about 55 feet from your body either way. So now think about that. You've just activated that. You go walk down the grocery store aisle with 55 feet? Just random humans and see what you experience. It makes you feel like an alien. Okay.
Wow, that's incredible, Gerald. 55 feet.
55 feet. Now this Ba is very, very important, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it out now since we're going to be sneaking up on chapter 5 pretty quick. This Ba field is our birthright that's been occluded from us. This energy, when you activate it, connects you back to what's called the sun soul. Mm. This is the derivation energy, a little piece of it from the creator of all, that Enki made sure we had an access to by giving us our electromagnetic interface. And Ningshita gave us with our latent circuits so that we would wake up to that, even in the beatdown that's going on, by encoding it secretly in our DNA. And I think we talked about that last time. We kind of got ahead of ourselves on the 8 latent circuits that Timothy Leary introduced. Yeah. But anyway, so the other, we got to get back onto the 3 aspects of the composition of man. The other one under astral was the non-physical, and this is the ability to move above and below on Earth, which is what we term an out-of-body experience. And later in this chapter, I talk about the steps to achieve that, for those that are interested, and the wonderful work done by Robert Monroe that saved my life as a 17-year-old when I was having out-of-body experiences and did not know what was happening to me.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Yeah. So this non-physical, so we've got the astral that has the mediator between the above and below, the non-spiritual, which I believe has to do with the Merkaba field that we talk about, and then the non-physical, and that's this silver thread that connects you from body to your energy body as you're out cruising around the simulator. Okay, and then the third one is this mental aspect. And there were 3 natures of that. And these are quite interesting to me. It's quite short. I'll just name them. A was the carrier of the will of the Great One. That's what so the mind has a component that has a aspect to it that is designed to carry out the will of the creator of all. And when you activate your Ba field, I believe that this energy template that specifies what you're supposed to be in the physical form, mm-hmm. and we can talk about that, I hope, how light creates matter, okay, all matter, that this template that specifies what your physical form should look like, when the physical form begins to malleably adapt to that through structure work, all of a sudden, I think the higher self and the actual self become one, and you get a very profound mission. And that's been my experience watching people. When you wake up, you don't get to wake up and go get in a hammock. If you wake up in the simulator with the Ba energy and the kind of stuff we're talking about here, generally you get tagged to serve humanity. And when you realize what's going on, you do it willingly.
The makeup of the human body that we're talking about, the physical, the astral, the mental, and all the different components that we've been talking about, Gerald, and to be designed by the Anunnaki, and then all these different elements to be controlled and tweaked and made, either shutting down some aspects and making some others still work and just enough. And it's so sophisticated, Gerald, what the Anunnaki have done with this worker, this replacement worker.
Well, that's one thing I discovered in studying anatomy and physiology. And as an electrical engineer, I didn't have a lot of knowledge about the body other than just what an athlete knows. I'm going to do back and buys this week when I work out, and chest and tries that week, and then I'm going to do my legs, just really, that's about, and then I got hamstrings and some quads and pecs and buys, that's about the limit of my physical knowledge. I knew that if I did stuff to it, it would change, but I didn't understand, from a energy standpoint, what I was doing. Anyway, so on this mental aspect, I think that's very interesting. The carrier of the will of the Great One. Now, all of a sudden, you got this Ba element that you activate that's a slice of the energy of the Great One, the creator of all. And now you realize your mind also has a carrier of the will of the Great One. Well, guess what? When that starts happening and your energy starts changing, you start operating more in accordance with the principles that are more in line with a immortal soul than someone who's caught up in an illusion of getting more matter, like a rat in a simulator. Okay. Item B for the mental was arbiter of cause. So everything that happens in your life, you're the arbiter of that. You caused it. And the third item is the arbiter of effect. Now, when it happens to you, you get to respond how you respond to it, because that's 90% of life. There's 10% of what happens to you, and 90% of how much you allow it to affect you, or what you're going to do to transmute what happened to you. Are you going to try to turn that darkness into light? All of a sudden, you're put into this place where you have to be the arbiter of effect. Okay, so these are very profound teachings that come from a document, which we're going to get into, about its historical legacy and its connection to Atlantis. They're talking about, hey, here's a rule book about the composition of man. Wouldn't you like to know this before you have a child and decide what the rules of interacting with the physical world are, so you can have an optimal experience? That's what I'm saying here.
Sure. Gerald, I'm going to just pause there because we're going to go to break. We're at the top of the first hour, and when we come back, we're going to get into the Kedushas and chakras and how this fits in with the Merkaba field, and how it all gels together, what it all means.
Perfect.
And
that's perfect.
Before we do, though, Gerald, I just want to give a message to the audience. We are doing a conference together in the Yucatan. It is the Anunnaki Realm of the Maya Equinox Ascension Symposium, September 2015. And of course, we're going to link that up on the websites, geraldclark77.com and jamesswagger.com and capricornradio.com. You'll find all the links there on all the web pages. And this is going to be unique for me to do this, Gerald, and unique for you too. I know, great to put our minds together and, to put a venue on and talk about this stuff in a practical sense, where people can come and join and learn, philosophize, and also ascend, Gerald. So, just want to give that a mention before we go to break.
Yeah, well, I'm really, really excited about it.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host, James, and we are talking to today's author, Gerald Clark, and you can check out Gerald's YouTube channel, Gerald Clark, and you can check out his webpage, geraldclark77.com. Of course, you'll see everything about Gerald there, a few articles, and his 2 books, The Anunnaki of Nibiru and Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising, which is what we're talking about today. We're in the thick of it. We're getting knee-deep in some very profound, insightful knowledge, and it's so exciting. I just can't wait for the second half of the show. Are you with me, Gerald?
I certainly am. How do you hear me, brother?
Great to be here again. Part 2, Gerald. I can't wait to get into this because I'm really excited about this show. I know we did 2 shows, Gerald, and we did so much groundwork to get to here today. And this is a real treat for the audience because I'm getting great feedback on the shows. This is a personal journey for me, Gerald, and I wanted you to know that I just find answers in ancient history. I find answers in the knowledge, and I see an author like yourself, Gerald, that brings this information to the forefront to try to analyze it, taking a current perspective from science and engineering, and try to understand what happened in our past. And as a result, you've produced a wealth of information in this book, Gerald. You really have. It's an awesome book. And I want to point this out for the audience too. I was listening to the audiobook, and when I listened to the audiobook, it's like it's a really interesting, sought after lecture that I'm listening to. But if I read the book itself, whether on Kindle, it's like it's reading like an excellent book. It's like it's the same book. One's just an audio version, but when you could just play the audio version, and it's just like this really interesting lecture that you're listening to. And then when you're reading the book with the diagrams, it's like a wonderful flowing book. It's like two books in one. It's bizarre. So, credit to you for that, Gerald.
Well, I appreciate that. You brought up something that I discovered retrospectively is once I'd written all my rendition of the later knowledge that you talked about that led to the models, I realized, wow, I wish I'd have had the foresight to have actually composed those models and include them as diagrams in the book, and I probably will do that. But that would probably require a lot more writing to discuss the diagrams, but they are very illuminating. It's like having a map while you're going through it. And I wanted to say something else that Krista discovered, and she's been very studious in trying to stay with me on my path, even though she's got her own mission and her own path that I'm very supportive of. But she actually took the book and was reading it simultaneous listening to the audiobook. So you had the visual from the words coming to you and also the auditory at the same time. And she said it was really, really effective. And I found that as well. Like today, I wanted to get back up to speed with you, what I just released in January. Well, it's only the end of February and it's starting to get cold for me, So I'm not in it every single day. But having the audiobook work, I just play that section and get myself back up to where I was. And of course, I have the unique advantage that it's my voice. So it puts me back in the context where I get re-excited, re-engaged so that we can continue with the same level of enthusiasm that we started with for this book.
Wonderful.
So,
I mean, again, for the listeners, get yourself a copy of Seven Planet Mercury Rise, and each chapter, there is so much in it. You get the most valuable book you can get because there's so much in it. You can just keep rereading this, and it'll take you a long time to take the deeply insightful knowledge in, because there's just so much of it packed in, Gerald. There's no nonsense in there. It's just like straight to business all the way. And very few people...
Well, actually, I actually found a few opportunities to have a little fun while I was writing this book. So I introduced a little hillbilly humor and a few other things in there that a lot of readers have come back and said, yeah, this was really profound, and I really appreciate the the emotional catharsis of a little humor in there mixed with it. So it was fun.
Sorry,
and I kind of have a little bit of a personality that I like humor. I see it as a fun thing.
Oh, don't get me wrong. The narrative is there, Gerald, for sure. The personal narrative is there in the book. Don't get me wrong with that. That's the point worth noting.
Yeah. But is there any fat in the book? Not much. And that's what I was accused of in the first book. Just giving it to you out of a fire hose, and it was all connected in a way where you go, okay, I can't refute that. Well, that's how engineers and scientists operate. And just as well as I do that it's an information-rich field when you're caught up in that kind of design space as an engineer and designer, and you're used to wrestling with a lot of gray matter and concepts and making it real and having alternative models and a way to visualize and view and understand the data is a deep dive. And, all engineering is a pretty deep dive, and the devil is always in the details.
I think that's the way the evolution of
detail-oriented lifestyle.
Sure, I think that's the way books have evolved, certainly in the last 20 years. The more complex subjects that are coming out and the more in-depth historical mysteries are coming out, people want more answers, and they want the complex data. The IQ of the reader is going up these days in alternative history and alternative genre, by a mile,
I totally agree. I think that has to do with this galactic cycle and awakening that was encoded in the Mayan calendar that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Sure, we're going to get into that towards the end of the show. Gerald, of course, I just mentioned and I led you into, before the break, the Caduceus energy and the chakras. And when you look at the Sumerian artistry of the Caduceus, this twisted serpent around the central spine, this is so sophisticated and it's so indicative of anything. This is the key thing about this show today. We're going to tie this together today on the Caduceus energy. So, I mean, the floor is open for you, Gerald. Tie in the Caduceus energy and the chakras. This is what we've been working to in the show.
Right. So, backing up a little bit earlier, I talked about having this deep thought experiment about how I was going to represent human energy that I wrote in this paper for the Guild for Structural Integration. And they published it in a magazine and stuff, but it was key. The key to me was that equation 5A. That's how I remember it. And that was the same equation number that showed up in some of the stuff that I published. So, but that equation actually evolved, and it's related to the caduceus energy and the chakras. So let's go through that first. You started to describe the symbol that was demonized as the snake, right? The evil snake. Mm-hmm. Well, Enki's symbol originally was the caduceus in the Garden of Eden, as he was, as he, designed us, gave us these constructs, and our body from a physiological standpoint. If you really study it from all the intricate systems that are operating simultaneously, it's a fascinating machine, the body. Anyway, so in this symbol of the caduceus that was carried by Enki and then handed off to Ningshita, this was representative of a single pole, vertical pole, had entwined serpents, 2 of them around it, starting at the bottom with their tails at a closer angle than their head. So it kind of created a V as it was going up, showing ascendancy up, okay? Well, these entwined serpents were kind of a mystery. What did they represent? According to a geneticist, they represent the entwined double helix of the DNA. So this was a geneticist symbol, okay? Mm-hmm. No surprise when you start getting into deep science. Various people had various functions, and these particular ones are geneticists, and maybe those ones over there are, aerospatial experts, whatever. Mm-hmm. But this was one of his specialties, okay? So the knowledge that Enki had was given to Ningshita, and this symbol with the single pole going up, the twin serpents around it with their heads facing each other at the top, a knob on the top of the pole, a little round knob, and also the wings coming out laterally. This was the symbol of caduceus, and that's why I put it on the front of my book, affiliated with this being who ended up carrying it. So why does it matter, and who cares? Well, first of all, it shows up in the American Medical Association as their chosen symbol to represent a healing art. And same with a lot of people have borrowed the symbol. I see it on chiropractor office buildings. I see it all over. And apparently it's in Britain too, with their medical.
True, yeah.
So, so the idea that it's affiliated with healing ought to make you go, really? Why? What's healing about the symbol, okay? You ever ask yourself that? Well, so let's break it down. So, from an energy standpoint, we are generally represented as, and this is true in structural integration as well. You have a positive pole at the top of your, along your spine, it's inside your head. And then you have a negative pole that's down near the bottom of your pelvis on the end of your tailbone, which is kind of an artifice of nature. But we have a little coccyx bone down there on our tail that has a nerve ganglia on it. And it's called the ganglion of Impar. Okay. That's representative of your negative pole. So this symbol of the caduceus represents a alchemical transformation, if you will, from a lower energy state to one in which you have the consciousness of the Anunnaki with the wings of Hermes coming out. Okay, so how does this thing work? Well, apparently, in our energy construct, representing us practically like a battery with a positive pole and a negative pole, and this comes up later in the Emerald Tablets about optimizing your lifespan by simply sleeping for an hour with your head to the north and then your head to the south and focusing your consciousness at 2 different centers, energy centers that essentially recharge your battery. It's really quite an interesting discussion. So in the caduceus, if there's energy that's infused into the being, or it's latent, or it comes from the environment, wherever it comes from, it apparently affects the bipolar energy in your body that spans from your tailbone all the way up to an area just inside the nose, which is taught by structural work. And it's termed, not to get too technical, called the sphenopalatine ganglia. And it's interesting from a chakra standpoint because it coincides with the place where the breath intersects with the Ida and the Pingala nadis, which are electrical centers represented in their system, okay, with the chakras. So now we have this symbol that represents some sort of transformation of energy from some state to another. And generally the caduceus, when it's drawn correctly, has 7 crossover points of the snakes, representing the energy vortices or the nerve ganglia that run up your central conductor or your spine. Okay, so it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid up in your head, but it also has spinal fluid in there that is the conductor for electricity up and down your pole. Okay, so you're with me? So now so now all of a sudden you're looking at the human body from an energy standpoint, symbolized by this caduceus. So let's run the energy from the bottom to the top, indicative of these rising serpents, and see how it is that the holder of this symbol, Ningshita, Thoth, Hermes, Mercury, okay, what he was communicating with it. So he talks about in the Emerald Tablets that he was given a mission to transform the hairy barbarians from their low-level state of knowledge into ascended beings in the mystery school in Egypt. So this symbol shows up there as well. So if you follow it from Sumeria into Egypt, it's quite interesting who was carrying it. So how does it work? So imagine that you are kind of a human antenna with a positive and a negative pole, such that when you're standing on the earth, your negative pole is closest to the ground, feet in contact. You have a negative, or you have a grounded energy state from the bottom. And as a lightning rod works, you put it up into the atmosphere, and it takes it causes a bipolarization of the ionization at the ground level where it goes into the ground, and then the positive electrons are actually near the top, just like your body. Well, those positive electrons attract the negatively charged, capacitive clouds that then discharge to that pole. So it's an attractive energy that causes that. Well, your body is kind of like the lightning rod in a way, and that the negative, where you're touching the ground, you're at the lowest energy state, and then near your head, as you're up in the field of gravity, you have a different electrical potential near the head, just like what's going on with the Tesla experiments, playing with graphene at various heights above the earth to see how much DC potential you get. Okay, so with that in mind, imagine that you infuse the lowest energy state, which they represent in the Hindu tradition as chakras. Okay, well, these chakras is nothing more than a nerve ganglia that can hold some energy. Okay, you with me? And apparently, if you think of this pole going from the bottom to the top as being a quantized set of these energy states that equate to consciousness, then you kind of see how the symbol could be interpreted. Okay, so if enough energy is infused into the ganglion of Impar, however it happens, through yoga, through external energy, through John 1:12, for all who receive him, to them gave he power, right? So it's a power issue. There's a receiving of power into the pelvis that then somehow gets into the ganglion of Impar that causes what some people term a Kundalini awakening. Well, there's a Kundalini potential energy in all beings that's represented by a coiled snake at the root chakra. So this coiled serpent represents the potential energy that's stored that can, under some circumstance, could be released. Now, in his Caduceus symbol, when it's released at the ganglion of Impar, it travels up sequentially using the Ida and the Pingala Nadi and the central conductor, the Sushushima is what they call it. Those energy pathways go to the different nerve ganglias along your spine, and now we know that each one is at a different wavelength. Well, all of a sudden you see an ascending model of energy that travels from the bottom to the top. It doesn't happen overnight, and each point of the caduceus, there's a block, okay, and it's intentional. You're not allowed to go straight from the bottom to the top without having the consciousness and the spiritual lessons under your belt to do so. So there's not only just an energy change, but there's also a spiritual path, an energy path that you have to walk in terms of how you operate as an arbiter of cause and arbiter of fact, okay? And hopefully it's in coincidence with the carrier of the will of the Great One, or the creator of all, and you'll arrive. Okay, that's kind of how the process is set up.
Wonderful.
Okay, and this is how the process was set up for ascended masters as well that went through mystery schools. One other thing about the caduceus that I wanted to bring up is we model these nerve ganglia as only being 7, and there are various models that I'm aware of. I've actually seen models where they represent up to 13 of the chakras. So if that's the case, it would change my equation 5a to, instead of 7 to being another number, but it wouldn't change anything else.
Would it ever be a case there's 5, Gerald, for any reason?
Excuse me?
Would it ever be a case there's only 5?
Not to my knowledge. I think the minimum number I've ever seen is 7.
7. The only reason
these map to actual organs or actual glands, if you will, like the 7th chakra. The top one maps to the pineal gland, and then the
Throat.
one at your third eye maps to the pituitary gland. So actually, it was a very interesting story in that Ida Rolf met Edward Casey, and they were discussing her model of the energy body, and he was kind of signed up believing that the 7 chakras were open through the endocrine system, which was these glands. And she had this other model, and they talked about it and realized that they were both true. So, this energy that travels up like a I don't know, kind of like a slow quantizing, overcoming these blockages in your body energy, also seems to turn on and activate these glands in a way that we didn't know they could work. And the prime example of that is when this energy climbs up your body, makes it through all these chakras, and finally gets to the pineal gland. We know from Dr. Straussman's work that in his book, The DMT, the Spirit Molecule, that this mystical chemical DMT, dimethyltryptamine, can be created by the pineal gland. Well, we know what kind of experiences people have when they are exposed to DMT. This is one of the most powerful hallucinogens on the planet, and your brain can make it, and specifically your pineal gland can make it when it's activated by the 7th chakra. And this had to do with this blissful state that a lot of yogis would seek, that they felt like once they've achieved and activated their crown chakra, or their 7th chakra, their pineal gland, that they experienced a state where they transcended space-time. They experienced this blissful state of, not really being caught under the illusion of Ka, but they'd done what we just previously talked about and activated their Ba, and they felt like, they were eternal. They take the body or leave it. And you lose the fear of death when this happens, okay? So this energy, however you categorize it, and I'm sure there's a frequency that could be identified. Well, we already know what the frequency is, okay? Maybe not of the potential energy that's released from the Kundalini, but when it shows up in the root chakra, we know what that is. As a matter of fact, through resonant field imaging, I purchased some software to actually look at the human energy body. And this kind of ties into the chakras and this human energy equation we'll talk about in a second.
Is this Kirlian photography?
And I would take a measurement at where you knew the chakra location was, get the frequency, knowing that the speed of light equals the wavelength times the frequency. You could always solve for the wavelength very easily. And the wavelength is color. So you'd end up with, colorized chart to show what your chakras were doing, so you could see if yours were the color of the rainbow or they were on their way. It was a real easy way to identify where people are at in their energy body.
Was that was that Kirlian photography, Gerald? Or?
No, it's called resonant field imaging, and basically all it is a high gain handheld antenna that is tuned within the frequency range of the human energy body. And some people at the Innovative Technology and Energy Medicine, where I bought the software, a really smart guy over there who's an electrical engineer. His name's Sean Furjanic. Anybody looking for this stuff, he's a good guy. I got licensed as a scientific investigator for resonant field imaging and polycontrast interference photography when I was running my structure practice, because I was so interested in human energy and what was happening structurally based on the paper I wrote. So I could, I guess get documented evidence that what I was saying was the case, which I feel like I have now, and I haven't really published that data because, it's private client data until I coordinate with all of them, say, is that okay if I do this? I don't want to violate any HIPAA laws relative to their medical information.
Sure.
So, but the reality is that, to me, after measuring it myself, there really is energy coming out of the body at various nodes, and it's not just the chakras. The resonant field imaging allows you to measure it all over the body. As a matter of fact, I'm going to scan in one of the, data cards that I used to use to fill in the data and then go convert it to a wavelength so you could see it and then see it on the screen. And I'm going to scan one of those and send it to you so you can have it and use it possibly in an augmentation for the radio or whatever you do with your pictures, okay? Mm-hmm. Or I'll put it on my Facebook page. I'll put it somewhere so people can see it, that it's real.
Sure.
Anyway, so the idea of this energy traveling up your chakras, activating glands in the endorphin system, and taking you to a state that the symbol represents. So we didn't finish that. So when this energy travels up like these entwined serpents up this central pole, it represents not only the kundalini energy going through the 7 nodes of your chakras or your ganglia nerve complexes and activating those wavelengths in there. Okay, this shows up in the equation. Well, once it gets up to the pineal gland and does its activation of that gland, well, we know it's a mystical experience, but it also seemed to have had an effect on the telomeres, which we know is related to aging. So you go back to what was just stated in this previous section we talked about, where you say mastering the elements allows the secret of life in the body, or the ba, to be activated, enabling one to choose to relinquish the body only when the mission's done. Wow. So that has an impact on the idea of aging significantly. Okay, so energy and matter and aging and genetics are all intertwined, especially as it relates to light. Mm-hmm. So this energy that's flowing up these Ida and Pingala nadis up and down, one goes up and one goes down. Then you have the central conductor. Well, when this energy hits the brain just right, you know, you have 2 hemispheres for the brain, and you have the corpus callosum that bridges the 2 halves. Well, oftentimes you can see the 2 halves are kind of disjoint. Somebody's oftentimes very left-brained or very right-brained, and, you know, and they don't seem to have a balance. Well, this process of creating the wings of Hermes, that's what the 2 wings pointing out of the side are. They represent the cerebral spinal fluid pumping correctly through the lateral ventricles of the brain. Well, that also completes the process of hemisyncing the cerebellum across the corpus callosum. Mm-hmm. So that makes you a complete person that's not imbalanced with feminine or masculine energy.
By the way, Gerald, I have a 51%, 49% balance of the right and left hemispheres of the brain. You can actually do right and left hemisphere tests, and I think they're so fascinating because some person will see somebody spinning one way and somebody will see them spinning the other way, and it's like it's the same test that's given to both people. It's like there's some graphics and stuff you can do online, but I do know I have a 51-49 balance, which I'm quite proud of. I am, Gerald.
Yeah. Well, also the caduceus, when it's looked at in various forms, it looks like a cross, almost like a crucifix if you see the wings from a distance, you know. So it's like a T-shaped thing, just like a crucifix. And I've made supposition that because of the role difference between the Enkyites and the Enelites and how they viewed their primitive workers, some wanted them just to be primitive workers, no access to higher consciousness. What are you talking about? Activating these energy vortices or ganglia in your body so that you have this higher consciousness what are you talking about? You know, so from a taskmaster standpoint, trying to get the most efficiency and optimization out of the primitive workers, this kind of discussion of our composition is off limits. Whereas from a scientist standpoint that says, hey, you know, I created you guys, I really only wanted to jumpstart you in your evolutionary process and then give you access to becoming one of us, but in the meantime, you're going to be our primitive workers until you wake up using your latent circuits and the energy states that if you follow the emerald tablets, which he tells you, and you differentiate energy and matter. It's the most important thing to do in this life, according to him. And he talked about this when he was a child, that was his focus. Well, he also said if you make that your focus, you'll find the answer. And it comes down to this Ba energy field that is your birthright that I described in detail in this book, okay? Mm-hmm. So back to the caduceus, this particular being who upgraded our DNA so we could procreate also carried a symbol that represented our alchemical transformation from an energy standpoint. And it wasn't just energy, because apparently energy and its relationship to our DNA is not very well understood. For instance, the more I look into energy that causes DNA to do certain things, change state, almost cymatically, it's sensitive to various frequencies. And like I said, frequency and wavelength together always produce the speed of light. So speed of light equals wavelength times frequency. So you're always talking about light, whether you're talking about wavelength or frequency ultimately. So I think we're going to talk about the composition of man and in general matter eventually being related to how light works with the periodic table of the elements and creates this illusion of call, this illusory and transitory matter. Because you see it created and destroyed. It's clearly something that rust and thieves can destroy, and it's not permanent.
Isn't there a new pioneering approach to healing the body with holographic light images of the human body, where they superimpose your light body onto the physical body to recreate broken cells and stuff?
Well, now you're touching on the fourth item that changes the connective tissue. Remember, we talked about pressure, tension, temperature. Well, now there's frequency. And this was the most interesting one to me when I was going through structure work, being an electrical engineer, that nobody talked about. No one really talked about, well, how could frequency potentially change the connective tissue state? Has anyone run a signal generator or up a linear ramp and tested the malleability of the fascia? I'm thinking like an engineer.
Frequencies and man was not understood until Tesla arrived. I mean, I've never known, I just want to mention Tesla for a moment. This man understood everything about frequencies, and as an electrical engineer, he is the pioneer of all. But, I mean, what he knew about frequencies, I think he tapped into something, Gerald, because he understood how frequencies affected everything, Gerald, and I have no problem.
Well, you bring up another interesting point. Remember, I defined interesting. I noticed that, princely type people in Europe that were around 20 to 25 years old were the ones that were making all these massive discoveries in science, in the 1800s and earlier. Mm-hmm. And Tesla was kind of in that group in my mind too. But it's, we talked about last show, where does inspiration come from? How did they get the idea to make that the focus of their awareness? You see what I'm saying? So I still think that the iterative dissemination of the knowledge that was on those Sumerian tablets relative to the tablets of destiny and civilizing of man at various stages when they were ready for it is what they did. And, and how they influenced us through their inspirational remote telemetry capabilities, however they did it. It was interesting because I noticed that certain discoveries would happen simultaneously, and they'd be at a geographic distance and at a point in time where they weren't communicating with each other, but still the discovery happened on two different continents at the same time. And, when you start looking at that going, well, how is that possible? Is this just random chance on something this sophisticated? I don't think so.
I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the last show. Did I talk about Ramanujan, the mathematician?
I don't believe you did, no.
Well, Ramanujan, whatever you say about anybody else, Ramanujan was this so sophisticated. I think he died at the age of 30s, early 30s, something. He's only 32 or something like that. But he was developing such radical mathematical theories. He developed his own branch. He did it without any formal training. He formulated all these ideas in his head with no formal training of mathematics. Just pure genius. But he always believed that he was downloading this as a frequency, either in the dream state or he was downloading it from a field or a frequency or a dare you say another dimension or whatever. He believed it was being downloaded to him. It wasn't his own creation. And it's still today.
Well, I think so.
Still today, Ramanujan mathematics is still, they're trying to crack it. He developed so much stuff. Some of the stuff he already discovered was already known to other Leibniz and all the differentiation and all the mathematicians of the ages, but he developed other mathematics that has been proven to be so sophisticated, above us. It's above most of the mathematicians that are still alive today, and they're still trying to crack his math that he left behind. They just can't even understand it. It's so advanced.
Divine inspiration.
And I believe he had the same birthday as you, Gerald. I believe he had I believe he had the same birthday. I think he was. I
better go look him up then. Hi, Ramanujan. Okay, I'll check him out.
But
send me a link on it, and I'll go look.
Sure.
Hey, so we talked about this caduceus and energy, and I wanted to follow that up with not too heavy of stuff, but how the equation that I came up with, and then every engineer and scientist likes to have an equation. If you're going to measure something, you got to have a model to make the measurement, right? So coming up with an equation for what human energy is and the parameters that are measurable so that you could actually come up with a number, that's what my equation allows one to do. Now, depending on how many chakras you choose to put into the summation of the equation will determine, how much added energy you would have versus only having your root chakra. Sure. Maybe not even working very well. So it has a profound impact on your choice to have a way to look at how you're doing in integrating your job here on this planet is getting the most energy that you can achieve in your body, the awareness you can have, so that you can accomplish the most complicated lessons in your path while you still got a material form to do it. You certainly don't want to have to be in a position where you think you got to come back, do this karmic wheel thing, and keep iteratively getting your lessons when, if you just knew what the answers were and what the questions were, you could possibly get it all done in this lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about, we talked about the speed of light equals the wavelength times the frequency. Well, we know the speed of light shows up in Einstein's equation. Another European, a German or Austrian who's working in a patent office, getting exposed to all kinds of neat ideas, kind of like you, James, being a radio show host that brings in lots of different people with disparate ideas that have gone to significant depth and are discussing it with you.
Sure.
So he was in that same state, where his mind was very stimulated by that. Well, he ended up with his equation relating energy and matter. Well, now that we said that distinguishing energy and matter is the most important thing in this life so you can get out of the illusion of Ka, he seemed to do that on his own. And so coming up with energy equals the speed of light squared, or mass times the speed of light squared, is quite a significant understanding. And it relates to your body as well. So I started with that equation going, how am I going to measure human energy? Well, we have an energy for material that can be converted into energy, uranium, plutonium, whatever, that's mass times the speed of light squared. And now that we know the speed of light is nothing more than the wavelength times the frequency, that makes more sense to use those since we've got an energy system in our bodies that's got different wavelengths at each chakra, right? So I'm looking at this place that Einstein started, hoping that I had a trustworthy equation to work with, knowing that most of what we've been taught in science is wrong. And so I started with that and said, well, okay, well, if energy equals mass times the speed of light, I don't have anything to really in my possession where I can measure the speed of light, and we don't measure mass very often. We measure the weight, and I have that. So let's convert that. So weight equals mass times gravity. Okay? Mm-hmm. So you start with that simple physical mechanics equation. Isolate the mass equals the weight divided by the gravity. Okay, now I'm going to put that into Einstein's equation for mass. Okay, so mass, the m gets replaced by W divided by G. Little g representing the accelerated force of gravity that we model here on Earth at 9.8 meters per second squared. Okay, and it's squared because it's treated as an accelerated force, and I take some issue with that, and I talk about that. Okay, anyway. So now we have the mass replaced with something that we can measure, the weight, and gravity is treated like a constant. So now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so now we got the speed of light. It's not real easy to measure unless you got some detectors, photon detectors that, and you can do it through a medium. Is it through a fiber, through the air? And by the way, depending on the medium that light travels through, may not travel at the speed of light. It does not travel at the speed of light through an optical fiber. Mm-hmm. Okay, for instance, if it travels through a denser medium than the air, which is categorized as a density of 1, that kind of is the measure of light traveling through. They give the density of air as 1, and then everything's relative to that. Well, and you got to discuss it traveling in a vacuum or not in a vacuum, because it's different. Okay? So in a vacuum, it truly travels at the speed of light. Sure. Not in a vacuum. So, it's a speed reference, but but light doesn't always travel at that rate, is what I want people to understand.
Sure.
Okay, so
just
the
like
other thing I want
spearfishing,
to
just like
understand is now we're going to take the wavelength and frequency and replace that for the speed of light. Now that's great. If you stop there, you go, okay, now I got energy equals weight divided by gravity times the wavelength of frequency squared. Now the next question you got to ask, okay, which wavelength and frequency? Is it the one at the root chakra or the one at the head? Well, this is where I think the Einstein equation falls short, in that it doesn't take into account the potential for more contribution of energy than just from the matter, okay? Because the speed of, so now so check this out. In the field of communications, you have a concept of multiple waves interacting with each other. And when they do that, it creates what's called the superposition.
Superposition.
So
principle.
waves, yeah. So when waves come together, the peaks are additive and the troughs are destructive. So if you've got peaks lined with peaks, you're going to get a higher peak.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a peak aligned with a trough, you're going to get a lesser amplitude. Okay. So now think about that in terms of the wavelengths, these wavelengths of color, of light at each of your chakras, which we now realize, there's not just one. So we don't have just lambda times nu squared or the speed of light squared in this equation. We have to account for each of those. So we got to give it an index and sum them over our chakras. So that's where the summation comes in. So I'm summing it from I equals 1 to 7, and it could be 13 depending on which chakra model you're using. I went conservative here, okay?
Sure.
And you realize that now instead of lambda nu squared, you've got lambda sub I, nu sub I summed from 1 to 7 squared. Well, if you compare that energy with E equals mc squared, all of a sudden you realize now if you assumed you had all the chakras working all the way up to the pineal gland, 7 of them, that you would get lambda nu squared, 6 additional of those, assuming that your root chakra was working. So now you're talking about 6 lambda nus squared. That's 36 times more energy than you had if only your root chakra was working.
Wow.
You see what I'm saying? So now all of a sudden you go, wait a second. If I get these wavelengths turned on in my chakras, I get more energy according to this equation? That's right. Okay, so that's one aspect toward mastering the external is getting this energy integrated into your body. So that means you got to get the blockages out of the way, get through your spiritual paths to get it all the way to your pineal gland. And this doesn't happen overnight if you just go through a yoga path. It typically takes a yogi who's very dedicated 20-something years to get the pineal gland to work like that. And that was the other advantage I saw in structure work is through this process, the structural integration process, by focusing on the pelvis where the coccyx bone is on the end of the tailbone, and focusing on getting the pelvis free and mobile. That was the IDA's goal every single session. Because if you do that, you realize that that's so important because when you're standing, inside the bowl of the pelvis is where the center of gravity is in your body. And it lands right in the bowl. And if you draw a line from it vertically up through your spine, out the top of your head, it doesn't go through any bone. That's the amazing part about this core of the human body. There's like a core and a sleeve, as she taught. And they're related to these energy lines and planes. Okay? So the idea of the body operating that way is quite significant. Okay, so what I want you to walk away with is my equation deviated from Einstein's equation by I give you the possibility of having 6 more lambdas, lambda nu squared, or the speed of light squared, in addition to the root chakra, assuming it's even working, okay, for most people. Mm-hmm. And you can usually tell by their lifestyle where they are in their chakras, okay? If they're focused on eternal things and the kind of stuff we're talking about, their Ba energy is probably activated, and they're looking to increase their consciousness because they realize that over their life, they look back 10 years ago and they go, well, I had this consciousness and I was thinking these thoughts and having these beliefs. And as I matured, got exposed to more things, now I've changed. Well, think about that in terms of your chakras changing and how dramatic your awareness changes out looking in the simulator relative to these changes in discrete quantized energy. It's significant. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that equation I thought was very, very, very monumental, and I took this broom pole analogy that I talked to you about earlier, and applied that to this equation. So how do you do that? Well, that's done with a limit. So imagine in the first case, we take the limit of human energy. What is the limit as gravity, this unknown, very strong force that we really haven't even figured out how to measure very well as of the last until the last 5 years. And it's still not very published about what gravity is. Okay, there's some inside knowledge about it. But if you take that and integrate it into that equation and do it analogous to this broom pole, what does that mean? So we'll take the limit. We'll take the limit as gravity approaches zero, meaning the broom pole is balanced and gravity's having very little effect, if any, on it. Now, that's not reality, and we can't get to a limit of zero, okay? The force is there, and you've got to interact with it. So there's some place where you still require a little tiny bit of input to be completely balanced in the field, like just like the broom pole, okay? Everything's in motion. It's not static. Okay? Think of it like a circadian rhythm of the eye. It's moving to get rid of the foveal centralis night blind spot so that it can add perspective. Reptiles don't have that. They have to sit real still until something moves to detect it. We have an advantage in that sense from our visual range. Okay, so now we've talked about getting this energy and having a measurement for it in equation 5a. And on top of that, I told you with the resonant field imaging and the polycontrast interference photography, I think we're pretty comfortable that the energy that we're talking about is real, and now it's quantizable and measurable. So from a responsibility standpoint, you as a human go, well, where are my chakras? How do I know? Well, there's access to people who have the technology to tell you now. And there's all kinds of stuff like you talked about, these new technologies that are imposing some energy template on the body. Well, now you go back and realize that I believe there was an energy template that's being essentially broadcast for all life forms that then through the DNA and the particular seeds of life that were given from the life form, they interact with a specific frequency to take on that material form, using light as its constituent unmanifested energy, combined with the periodic table of elements of whatever the planet has to create life, to create matter, to create rocks. I mean, it's all created out of the same thing.
It's a wonderful way of looking at it, Gerald. It is.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about it that way.
It's crazy to think about it, but it makes sense, and there's logic there, and there's science in it, and that's...
Well, that's the thing is, the understanding of energy and matter basically bust the lid off of the holographic simulator, and that's where it leads. That's why people like Tesla, Wilhelm Reich, anybody who was looking into how energy works, and especially as it interacts with the human body, like Wilhelm Reich with his orgone bioenergy work, and there was others too as well that really got tortured for it, because this was the unveiling of the false Merkaba that had held their consciousness in a place where they couldn't understand what was going on.
I think the ancients, and the reason I asked you about the 5 chakra possibility, because there's a megalithic egg in the Lagos Museum in Portugal, and it seems to be showing the caduceus. I'll send you a picture after the show. I should have sent it before the show. I only thought of it on the show anyway, but it does only look like there's 5 nodal points, though. Maybe there's some more. I haven't actually seen it up close underneath the egg, but it looks like there's a central spine with 2 twisted serpents going around the central core, with 5 nodal points that can be measured. Maybe there's more on it.
Yeah, I've seen it so many different ways. Like the one on the front of my book only shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 7. So I'm like, but actually the little jewels on there have the colors of the chakras that go from the bottom top, but it doesn't show the serpents crossing over the right number of times, in my opinion.
And then,
anyway, it's, but it's still symbolic of this rising energy. The part we didn't really emphasize was how light interacts with the DNA, because I truly believe whatever this process is, when this energy moves up through your body, the DNA is changed also, and certain latent DNA artifacts that Ningxia programmed into us actually get turned on through this process as well. Remember what we talked about, being exposed to symbols, being exposed to archetypes, all the different things that trigger these, whether it's through the visual system or the auditory system or the somatic system. I think there are various triggers for people that
another thing in my megalithic research, Gerald, is that I think the ancients, if you go to Gavrini megalithic chamber in 4000 BC, something like that, in 3500 BC, sorry, in Goat's Island. Gavri means Goat's Island because of coast of Brittany in France, but they're showing on granite, which has got lots of crystal and silicon dioxide in it, so incredibly hard to carve. And they have drawn multiple waves coalescing with each other into constructive and destructive interference.
Superposition principle.
Superposition principle again, and is that with acoustics or is that with light wave? And
it works. It does with both.
It does it with both.
Actually, light won't do it if it's a photon in the double slit experiment, but it does when it's a wave. That's the interesting part about it. It shows those spectral bands whenever it's not being observed, and then you observe it, it shows up as particles going through the slits. For people who don't know what that is, there's some wonderful videos on the double slit experiment on YouTube or non-physicists that really, when you see that and realize that every time you observe light, it changes its nature, that you're not allowed to know the degree with which this unmanifested energy from the creator of all, who lives in the circle of light, as you'll find out later, and creates with light, that behavior of light is a mystery, and it's very, very interesting. And it's where physicists get to the place where they go, there's something going on with the energy field that we truly do not understand. And, it's got intelligence encoded in it, and it's very mystical.
They say, Gerald, where we're at today that, we're so advanced and science is saturated, but I think we're only scratching the surface, Gerald. We haven't, we're only really just scratching at the surface still.
Well, I agree. And generally, the people that are scratching deepest under the surface are the people at defense agencies that are researching the latest weapons, like DARPA and those kind of folks. And it's really, so they end up with this technology that helps you kill people, and that eventually ends up in commercialized, so you can go buy it at Walmart, or some specialty store, whether it's infrared binoculars or all the other different things that come out that end up in the commercial market.
Gerald, we're talking about the frequency, how it affects man, and maybe we'll just tie this in with the last topic because we'll hit the second hour before we get any deeper. Maybe can you tell us how this relates to the Tolkien calendar and the nine main frequencies? And of course, I want you to tell us why Anunnaki and the Mayan world are linked as well, if you can. Maybe just lead us in why we're talking about the Tolkien calendar, Mayan frequencies, and why we're talking about all and the Anunnaki realm there.
Okay, just real quick. Okay, so we know from the Sumerian records that Enki had a couple sons. One of them was Ningshita, and the other one was Marduk, and he had lots of other ones too. But these ones show up in the main accounts. Okay, and Ningshita ended up becoming Thoth in Egypt, but he had some other names too there, which really shocked me. And Marduk ended up leaving the Mesopotamian region and going back to his father's domain circa, I guess it was around 3114 BC. Okay, and I think it was August 11th or something like that. That was that turned out to be the start date of the Mayan calendar.
Sure.
Well, so what do we know? We know that Ningshita had a little bit of an issue with Marduk over which calendar to use, according to the writings. Marduk wanted to use only the solar calendar in Egypt, whereas, and I think it was in Heliopolis, I'm not sure. And Ningshita wanted to use the solar and lunar calendar to take into account more accurate issues with averting leap year and all the other things that we do in our calendar to make up for lost time when we mess up. And, so apparently around this date, around 3114 BCE, Thoth recruited some stone workers, the Olmecs, it turns out. So actually they were Ethiopians, I believe, from the land of Kush, and then went over to the Yucatan to restart a new civilization. Mm-hmm. And it's quite interesting. So this territorial separation led to Zecharia Sitchin writing a book called The Lost Realm. And he tied together biblically the lineage from Adam to Noah, in particular the relationship between Lamech, Enoch, and Methuselah, to the relationship with Thoth, because there were some connections genetically there.
Sure.
Right? So anyway, and remember we talked about this last time when we went back into the story about Noah and the obscuration about who Ham was as an offspring from Tubal-Cain. And then you end up realizing that Thoth shows up in that account, and that's why the whole story was made up in the first place, was to obscure the connection to the Babylonian kings and then to him. So, anyway, so Thoth goes to, according to what I've read, he landed in Guatemala. There's a really neat stone edifice there that shows the handover of knowledge from Sumeria into the Yucatan, that also had a picture of an elephant and some things like that to tie you in with Africa. Well, this became very controversial with the Olmecs about their origins in Mexico. And there was clearly stone heads that were carved that looked negroidal with,
sure,
the features of Africa that showed up there. And they're like, no, that can't be. Well, when they found carvings of elephants and things that also in that same culture, they realized there was a direct connection to Africa and that couldn't be avoided anymore. And a lot of people still don't know this. Anyway, so according to the writings, Thoth was known to the Aztecs and eventually the Maya as the winged serpent god, who was Quetzalcoatl. And they portrayed him as a tall being who was bearded and light colored skin with blonde hair and blue eyes. Well, this is very telling, because you go read about the birth of Noah in the book of Enoch and you realize that he had blonde hair, blue eyes, and the whole thing. So, so the idea that I put Ningshita on the cover of my book with blonde hair and white skin that's the reason I did that, is because I think in various incarnations he could take on any body he wanted. Okay, but as Quetzalcoatl, he was the winged serpent god, meaning he carried the caduceus. Here we just talked about his symbol with the serpents, right, representing a geneticist, and the fact that he was winged probably referred to the fact that he had his own aircraft that he was a designer of, and he talked about this in the Emerald Tablets as well. Not only that, he fabricated one for the battle between Seth and Horus, which I found very interesting. So it turned out that Horus was using one of the winged craft that Thoth designed for him. That's how he smote Seth. Okay, wow. We got a little off track, but so now we're in the Guatemala. The civilization that Thoth came over as Quetzalcoatl to start here showed up in these fabulous equinox and solstice temples all up and down Mexico. And so so what I want to bring out with this conference that we're doing is I've always seen for many years a direct connection of the Anunnaki gods, which I put in my god table, across multiple cultures. And it turned out that one of the neatest ones was right in my own backyard, right over from San Diego, down in Mexico, with Tenochtitlan. And this was a link to the word Enoch. The Te antecedent in that word, it shows up in a lot of names, but the name of the town, which became Mexico City, was named after Enoch. And then now you go back to the book of Enoch and realize when they went to this domain to find him where he was in this other land, well, it looks like it was Mexico City. So Tenochtitlan, according to the temples that are there, one of them belongs to Quetzalcoatl and two other entities, is a pretty stellar place. But, now the city's grown around it, so it's kind of obscurated, but it's probably worth a visit. But the other place right outside of there that became the capital, the headquarters for all of the Mayan civilizations all across the Yucatan and all up and down the peninsula, happened at Teotihuacan. So they had a pyramid of the sun there, the pyramid of the moon there, and Quetzalcoatl's very special temple there. And the reason it was special is because when I was researching this area and the Emerald Tablets, I realized that in the prelude to the Emerald Tablets, Dorial, who was a member of the Great White Brotherhood, which was the Egyptian therapeutate, or the priesthood in Egypt, that guarded the Emerald Tablets, okay, he was affiliated with them. Well, he talked about the ancestry and the history of the tablets, and of course he knew they came from Thoth and where they had been hidden at various times, based on civilizations rising and falling. Well, one of those civilizations where it was hidden was here in the Yucatan, and he mentioned it being hidden at the Temple of the Sun. Well, now you know that Quetzalcoatl's temple was there, and that was the headquarters, and they were doing ascension training, just like they were doing at the mystery schools at Giza. So all of a sudden, you got a place in Giza where he tells you in the tablets he hid his records for you to go find them. Okay. It was like almost like a scavenger hunt in one of the tablets that we're going to get into. But he also did the same thing in the Yucatan. And it turns out it was at Teotihuacan. So that's why it's so important to me. What was he doing in terms of frequency, ascension, overcoming the telomeres, all the things that they talked about in the mystery schools that spent over 25 years to become a graduate with along the Nile versus what they were doing in the Yucatan. So the thing that got really interesting about that is he had introduced the calendar back in Samaria. And now here Ningshita had his opportunity where it seems like he was untethered to be able to implement it the way he knew he wanted to. So when you really study the Mayan calendar and how it's basically a larger gear turning a smaller gear, and the ratios are such that they're timed to some galactic event, which they called passage through the dark rift. All of a sudden you're talking about some pretty significant science here,
Oh, yeah.
and the astronomical knowledge that the Mayans had is almost, I don't think it's been overcome by anybody.
Unprecedented and never been equaled.
Never been equal. Well, that's cosmic in itself. So if that's the case, what are we still doing using the Nippurian and the Gregorian calendars if they're not worth the stones and shells that were used to count the precession of the equinox? You know what I'm saying? So there's some deep knowledge that Thoth released to these Mayan priests that ended up in their codices that we still don't truly understand. Well, what do we know about frequency in the 9 rows of the Tzolk'in calendar, which you brought up? This I found fascinating. Okay, because now all of a sudden there's a concept of the Schumann resonance, which happens when radiation strikes our planet. So if you take electromagnetic spectrum, have it bash into a spherical body that may or may not have a metal conductor, you'll end up, based on the size of it, with some standing wave frequency as a result of this spherical resonance, if you will. Okay, it's resonating in a big sphere and creates a standing wave frequency as a result. Well, that's based on the circumference of the sphere on the outside. So if you take the speed of light divided by the circumference of the Earth on the surface of the Earth, you'll get a particular frequency, and that turns out to be 7.4 to 7.8 hertz, depending on what your measurement is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all of a sudden you realize this frequency falls within the brainwave region of a human, which runs from about a half a hertz at the delta end, very low frequency, up to. Now, this is the thing that's controversial. I had listed in my tables that I didn't believe the human brainwave frequency went much beyond 20 hertz. I saw a model that says it goes all the way up to 60. And I have no way to verify that just now, but I need to because it's important. Well, if it goes as high as 60 hertz, it means it's the same refresh rate that you got on your electricity in your wall. And that's very coincidental and kind of scary.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that means that you could be doing something modulating data on your electrical outlets in your wall, and it coincides with your brainwave frequency, and that's scary in itself. And so these 9 underworld frequencies. So now you're going, what does that mean? An underworld frequency? Is this some demon frequency? No. If you take the various measurements into the Earth approaching the core at some circumference, and it changes as a function of the radial arm and polar coordinates extending from the center of the Earth. If you check if you came up with 9 different circumferences and took the speed of light and divided by it, you'd end up with brainwave frequencies that landed within your brainwave. And I did this on my blog just recently, on my website, just messing around with a spreadsheet to see what the distances was, what the circumference would be, and how that would impact your brainwave region. Well, it turns out that Dr. Johann Kellerman wrote a book, The Mayan Cosmogenesis, I believe was the name of it. I'm doing that from memory, but he was very influential to Ian Lungold that we talked about last time, and he talked about the landing of these Mayan frequencies into the human brainwave region, and so you're talking about dimensional access and the 9 worlds within worlds that we're going to end up talking about later. Consider those worlds within worlds are frequencies accessible in your brain. You with me?
Oh,
so
wow.
To me, a dimension is a frequency access that that humans can achieve within their own brainwave state. Okay, so I believe that's what happens in out-of-body experiences, that you end up in a brainwave state where your human energy can separate from your body, and I know we're going to talk about that later. Okay, so let's talk about the Tzolk'in calendar just real quick, so we can tie this in with why I chose that area to illuminate relative to human consciousness and the timing that was encoded in the Mayan calendar to coincidentally land when our solar system passes through the Milky Way galaxy center, or the dark rift, as they called it. Well, this 9-row and 13-column Tzolk'in calendar is very telling. The columns are separated into day and night, 7 days of creation and 6 nights of darkness or destruction. Okay, that's how it's set up. So it comes out as 13 columns. And you'll read later that 13 is a very, very magical number because it turns out to be the sign of Orpheus and the favorite number of the creator of all. How about that? Maybe that's why we don't have a 13th floor in the elevator, because it's a lambasting to the creator of all. Friday the 13th, all that stuff that demonized the number 13. Mm-hmm. Wrong. Wrong.
Sure.
Okay, so now we've got 7 columns of day, 6 columns of night coming up at 13, and they basically represent it as going from left to right, starting over 14 billion years ago. Okay, when the creation of our solar system, and then there was a telescoping from in the columns. Each day to night was divided by 20. Okay, so you had a division by 20 at each step, and it telescoped down almost exponentially as you get toward the top. So in the lowest row, the 9th row, the frequency of that row in the underworld frequency represented primitive life, like cellular life, single cell life. And as you move up the rows from 9 up to 1, you end up at the highest state, which is universal consciousness. Okay, so these frequencies were tied to human consciousness. And each one, at each level, described what life forms occurred based on this frequency being, I don't know, accessible, activated, whatever caused the ascension up those 9 rows to happen. It happened based on a time sequence, okay? And this was known to Thoth, who encoded it in this calendar, which is fascinating to me. So is it coincidence, I might ask you, that the highest state of consciousness, by the time you get to the last row, every day-night cycle happens every 20 days. So you got a creation period of 20 days where there's just going to be extreme light and then 20 days of darkness. And because of that, your thoughts manifest in the time frame of the telescoping level that you're on. So now all of a sudden time has sped up, according to Ian Lungold, and that you think a thought, it's going to manifest in no later time than 20 days. Whereas before, on the previous layers of that Tzolk'in calendar, it could have taken a long time from you thinking something to it happening. Mm-hmm. And so part of that, I believe, is designed into us to make us realize we are the co-creators with the Anunnaki, and that our thoughts create real things, and that's designed for it to get shorter and shorter, so we start noticing that we become responsible for our creative thoughts, or destructive ones, whichever. Okay? So that's where we are. That happened, according to Ian Lungold, that reaching of the final row in the Tzolk'in calendar, mm-hmm. and passing through the dark rift, which I personally saw myself when I was out of contact in the desert a couple of years ago. Out in the desert, looking at the horizon at a certain time of the day. And you could see the dark rift intersecting where the sun was coming up. And that's what they meant, the sun rising in the dark rift. Well, that happened at the sign of Orpheus that we talked about the last show. So when that place happened, and the part that I don't know is exactly how long it takes to transit the dark rift. I got some research to do. I believe it's minimally 3.5 years. I think it could be 7 years, and that's where the tribulation came from.
Sure.
But going through that dark rift, there's all kinds of earth changes that happen. And I further postulated that event that Quetzalcoatl, Ningshita, Thoth encoded for his priests that were keeping track of time in these solstice and equinox temples, knew that when we reached that point, you'd be at the universal consciousness, and that's the time when you would most definitely, if you hadn't figured it out already, realize that you had been enslaved and you were caught up in a relationship to beings that you couldn't put your finger on. And I believe that was the time that they would do disclosure, and I think it's in the process. Mm-hmm. So several governments have disclosed their relationship to ancient aliens, if you will, or ancient astronauts.
Sure.
Okay. So I think that's happening, and I think for the United States to be sandwiched by Mexico, who's disclosed, and Canada, who's disclosed, that the ultimate disclosure from the United States is not happened because one of those beings is part of the, I don't know, overweening pride and aspiration to establish a new world order and keep all the primitive workers as primitive workers, enslaved and enrolled in their agenda, which means serving them.
Mm-hmm. Gerald, how does
that's at odds. Go ahead.
How does the Mayan people accept this? Anunnaki links, or Quetzalcoatl was a Sumerian figurehead. Do they know about it? Do they accept it? Do a few know, or are they totally oblivious to this link?
I don't know that I've done enough of a demographic survey to answer that accurately. From my personal exposure, most do not know. Most have completely lost their Mayan cultural connection because of what Cortez Pizarro did when they came here and completely destroyed that civilization, all seeking to get gold for Queen Isabella and those greedy SOBs in Spain and Portugal. I mean, my goodness, to send people over on behalf of your country to go rape and pillage, destroy Mayan codices, melt down their gold artifacts just to turn it into ingots in your commerce system. Which, by the way, the Mayans didn't view gold as a commodity for commerce. They knew it belonged to the gods, and they treated it accordingly. Oh yeah, we use it for this and this, and we get permission to do whatever. We're just the ones that gather it for them. So that was no different than what was happening in Africa. Remember?
Sure.
In the Atrahasis.
Gerald, we're at the top of the second hour. It's been wonderful talking to you. I want to mention the conference again, the Anunnaki Realm of the Maya Equinox Ascension Symposium. That's going to happen in September 2015 on the equinox, obviously, finishing on the equinox event at the Pyramid of Kukulkan in Chichen Itza. Of course, we're going to tie in your Anunnaki Nibiru connection with Quetzalcoatl, Chichen Itza, the Long Count calendar with Egyptian origins, Ascension Temple, the Emerald Tablet connection to the Mexico's pyramids that we talked about on the show, holographic state of reality, presenting models for that, keys to breaking the illusion of matter, the Tolkien calendar, again what we talked about in galactic timing. It's going to be a super fascinating presentation, Gerald, on your part. I can't wait for that. Of course, I'm going to speak as well. I'm going to get into archaeoacoustics, archaeoastronomy, altered states of consciousness, Sumerian sexadecimal system and how it's linked with acoustics knowledge, geometry and music, and how it's also linked with the precessional cycle as well, and how it all fits together. So it's going to be a super exciting event, and that's going to be up soon on your blog as well, Gerald, I believe, geraldclarks77.com, and my tours events page on jamesswagger.com too. Gerald, I really thank you for your time today. What another fascinating, heavy-hitting show, but complex in some subject matter, but incredibly enlightening all the same.
Yeah, listen, and the fact that we're having this level of dialogue couldn't be possible unless you were doing what you're doing. I very much appreciate you being a student of the information and seeking to understand the authors that come on, because that's the key that makes your dialogue so great. And I want to say you're just a natural at it, going from topic to topic. You're the Larry King of Ireland as far as I'm concerned. And I truly think I tied my horse to the right cart. And I really appreciate you, and I think of you as my Irish brother. I truly do. A fellow seeker that's really doing great things, and I really appreciate you, and I'm really excited about this conference.
Oh, too kind, Gerald. Kind words, and no, for sure. I mean, like I say, a 5-day event. We're going to get some meditation there as well. In the field, we'll be out doing some temples, investigating some presentations. It's going to be a fun 5 days around the equinox.
Yeah, the people that are coming will have their own private entrance gate to go right to the temple. So there'll be some hands-on stuff. Go and experience it for yourself, not just be looky-loo. You know, we're gonna tie in the deep knowledge of our history with part of it that's spilled over there. And listen, I've started getting issues about who are the gods in the Vikings in this culture, and I'm starting to do that because this is true for everyone around the world. So yeah, the Mayans are going to wake up to find out that Quetzalcoatl was the mankind's consciousness coach and the author of the Emerald Tablets, and that's a profound thing to realize.
You know, I just posted I just posted an article today that we have ancient Irish books that talk about the son of Noah coming to Ireland, forming the Numidians, the clan called the Numidians, one of the five groups of people who conquered Ireland. Incredibly interesting, Mike. I think this whole global system of cultures are all intertwined in the most intricate way, Gerald, that we could ever have imagined. I really do.
Yeah, and getting everybody on the same creation account, like we talked about at the break earlier, it heals relationships. It creates a go-forward place where everybody's on a common sheet of music, so that there isn't conflict. It's a really beneficial thing for mankind. So the more we do it and illuminate it, the better it's going to be.
Well, Gerald, again, thank you for your time today, and we'll talk to you in the not too distant future.
Okay. Well, next time we'll get together, we'll decide when the next show is going to be, and we'll pick it up from there. I'm so excited. Talk to you later, brother.
Take care.
This is your host, James Swagger, signing off. Don't forget to check out the full MP3 archive at capricornmembers.com. You can subscribe there. You can also follow the Capricorn Radio YouTube channel, the Capricorn TV YouTube channel, and of course the Capricorn Radio TV Facebook group and Facebook pages. Or you can also follow what I do, James Swagger, in the James Swagger group on Facebook too. And follow all the links for the show on capricornradio.com. Greetings everybody around the world, wherever you may be. You're very welcome to this edition of Capricorn Radio. This is your host, James Swagger. And for the next hour, we'll be getting into some fascinating topics. But before I do, you can check out the links for the live shows at capricornradio.com. We also have a new members area there. You can check out the full MP3 archive at capricornmembers.com. I'm introducing a special lifetime membership fee for Capricorn members. This will entitle you to Capricorn radio shows and Capricorn TV interviews. To sign up for the members area, head over to capricornmembers.com, or equally follow the links on capricornradio.com. Don't forget you can also follow the Capricorn Radio YouTube channel, the Capricorn TV YouTube channel, and of course the Capricorn Radio TV Facebook group and Facebook pages. Or you can also follow what I do, James Swagger, in the James Swagger group on Facebook too. I have a super interesting returning guest today, Mr. Gerald Clark, and if you haven't caught out the previous shows of Gerald, please check out the archives. You'll find that on capricornradio.com, and you'll find it also on Gerald Clark's webpage too, geraldclark77.com. You'll find the links there for his books as well, his bio. Of course, he's the author of two books delving into the world of the Anunnaki and their legacy too. First book, Anunnaki of Nibiru, and the second book, Seventh Planet Mercury Rising. And that's what we're getting into today, the Seventh Planet Mercury Rising book. We're doing a featured presentation of Gerald's book on the show, and we're getting into some really deep concepts. And as the show has been developing, so has the depth of what we're getting into. So today, with the gloves are off, and no doubt we're going to get into some super fascinating stuff. So without further delay, let's bring on today's guests. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James, my Irish brother. It's so good to be back, having a real dialogue with some real meat.
That it is, Gerald. And, this is a real dialogue. We've done some pretty heavy-hitting shows, and I'm just glad that it's continuing. I even had a couple of discussions during the week with the show we do, and I don't normally get to do that, Gerald. And I had a couple of private dialogues with the show, and the response that I'm getting, and the information that we're talking about is just super fascinating because it's very current, it's very pertinent to where I want to go in life, what I want to explore, and a lot of people are into this, Gerald, because they don't just want to know about the history, they want to know what it means for them. They want to know what they can do with it. I mean, if we were genetically altered as a slave species, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? If that was the case, Gerald, well then, where does that leave us today? Are we going to evolve, or were we permanently just, made with defects? And all these questions are abound now, Gerald. All these questions are abound, and that's what we're getting into, I guess.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that process you're describing where someone finds out the truth about their origins, and there's a deconstruction process that kind of goes along with that they have to start from the past, corroborate, And then they start fast forwarding to their lives and how it affects them here and now. And it usually takes some time, but, and it's a process I've watched since I've been in this, I don't know, this realm for several years now. I started researching this stuff in 2003 or 2004. And, you know, I was one of those kind of sideline observers, even though I was staying fully engaged in my research, but I couldn't really know what that place is. And clearly it's in our body for us. Okay. The most important real estate on the planet is your body. It's your interface to the infinite. So from that standpoint, when we start talking about the composition of man, first of all, you got to start from energy and describe what this is that animates one sports, player on the chess game to have more energy, more capabilities, more whatever than another one, you know. And a lot of it comes from when you're young like that and you don't have the mental constructs to put together, you know, a way of thinking. You haven't been trained, you know, to visualize your performance like Olympic athletes are. I mean, it's just natural. It was just natural, raw talent / you know, structure all together that would produce whatever landed on an elementary or junior high school football field, right?
Sure.
So I was thinking deeply about where energy meets matter, and so I ended up, it's a bullet point later on in our discussion where I talk about the human energy equation. So we'll get to that when we get there. But so this composition of man. So what are we, and what models do we have to represent ourselves? Now I didn't share this one with you, but while we're on the idea of structure work, there are lines and planes in the body that basically, if they're understood and how they relate to the vertical field of gravity, we come up with a pretty simple way to measure a human relative to this field and go, well, you know, is man this material form that's being beaten down by this force and ends up, you know, all his structural components going wide and so one thing I want to bring up is in the composition of man, there's something very malleable about the human form. And I'll give you some examples. Number one, think about a woman who has a baby. She starts out, you know, with a normal abdominal section. And all of a sudden, it can grow to the size of a basketball.
Sure.
And then produce a baby, which stretches various organs to allow this to occur. And then, you know, with some minor side effects, the body goes back to the way it was before this huge change happened in a 9-month period. Now, the other extreme is people who gain a lot of weight, you know, and then lose a lot of weight. You can see that the body can be made various forms. Then there's the extreme muscle building community that's doing bodybuilding.
Oh yeah.
So the idea of transforming this matter we call man or woman into its various forms that it can take on has quite a range, quite a broad range.
Sure.
Okay. Well, one of the key elements of that is there's malleability there.
Interesting
in
outlook,
our
Gerald.
structure, in our tissue. So what is that? Well, structure work went into this very deeply, and I wasn't so concerned about the anatomy and physiology as I was figuring out what they knew that I could learn and do this and help my kid who had really bad issues with his connective tissue. And this is how I started. So let's talk about the structure of the body from that standpoint, and I'll give you some neat models that we used, in addition to the ones that came from the Emerald Tablets, from Drunvalo, and other sources, okay? But this one was pragmatic for me, and I tried this hat on, and it truly fits, okay? Mm-hmm. So, what do we know about the composition of man relative to the structural integration model? Well, from that standpoint, gravity is everything. And so this strong force field that shows up in my equation 5 is the figure of merit to align to. Okay, let's just start with that. So the whole concept is to take the body and align it to this infinite force field we call gravity. Well, how is that done? You just posture, stand up straight, and push your shoulders back, and you're good to go? Not hardly. The reality is by the time you're 6 years old, with no knowledge of how to integrate with the gravity field because you were never taught, you can't sit up straight, and your structure is already so deviated that without intervention with structural integration, you will grow into that pattern, and it's going to be with you for life. That's the reality. And that's so when we're talking about the composition of man, this hidden knowledge about how the body works was abominable to me once I realized that there's true freedom in the body if you just know how it works. Mm-hmm. Okay. And a lot of it has to do with this concept of gravity in the structural integration domain, referencing gravity as the therapist. Well, that's kind of a great deference to some infinite force. But the reality is, if you think about that from a scientific standpoint, what is this field of gravity doing with your energy body? And that's why I ended up with my equation in the first book, where I derived it for people. And then the second book, I showed it and then described it in natural language so that there wasn't, lambda, nu, and all these Greek symbols for people that were turned off by that kind of math. And it was pretty simple math. But anyway.
I think that's what differentiates you, Gerald, from other Anunnaki authors. And I know you've evolved into the second book to bring this into human terms and what it means for us as well. But like I say, some people just focus on the genetics of the Anunnaki and that they engineered this, and they don't go into the depth of it. They just mention it. They regurgitate it. But Gerald, you do something different. You talk about this in terms of human energy, frequencies, consciousness, and the chakras, and you apply your electrical engineering background to talk about wavelengths. And we touched a little bit on that last time, but it's a wonderful, well-rounded, insightful perspective, Gerald.
It is a kind of goofy perspective that I ended up with, and that I was brave enough to not worry about someone judging me and try things that I couldn't explain scientifically. So I broke the scientific method in exploring alternative human energy and consciousness and all these areas that were of interest to me, in my truth-seeking path, while at the same time I could back up, put on my scientific hat, scrutinize what I had done, and try to explain it in terms scientifically that the world would accept, because everybody's so left-brained. They haven't caught up with this ancient knowledge of what we used to know about our body. So there was one other thing, a special thing I wanted to throw in about structure work. I launched into learning these techniques, being exposed to it during a triathlon, which I think I told the story before, in order to find a way to deal with what was happening in my kid, JJ. And he was in braces. He was about 5 years old, and he was having trouble walking. Well, there was some genetic side effect from his syndrome caused his connective tissue to droop on his body. It was very loose. So much so it looked like he had big socks on around his ankles where it drifted down and was covering his feet. And his ankles were almost indistinguishable at the talocrural joint, right where his ankle was. So I'm like, what's going on with it, with this? And that's when I discovered that Ida Rolf had been probing into, the founder of structural integration. She'd been probing into the same issue of malleability of tissue for her kid who had polio. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I got the same kind of issue with my kid, because if whatever's going on with his connective tissue, if that wasn't happening, we wouldn't have these braces that go in underneath his shoes and all this crap, making him walk like a robot. It looked ridiculous. And it was really not comfortable for him. And with a special needs child that can't communicate with you verbally, you always ask yourself, are they in pain? Are they comfortable? In Kauai, that was taught by the Guild for Structural Integration, based out of Boulder. And so I was doing the final 2 phases of my holistic healthcare practice training to become a structural integrator for my kid JJ. Really not to open a practice, but I just wanted this knowledge that we discussed previously. Sure. Anyway, so in this process, I was sitting in my room looking out over a lagoon in Kauai, and it was a really deeply spiritual setting on the property where the kahunas used to go to receive their healing, in terms of the energy from the acoustics of how the hills shaped the sound of the ocean coming in, to the waterfalls that were endemic on this 27-acre property. Okay, I mean, it was amazing, and you could actually see from Kahuna Springs, you could see Makaleha, one of the high peaks where there were 4 waterfalls coming down while you're in a classroom setting on this property. It was absolutely stellar place to learn about the human energy. Anyway, so I'm sitting here looking out over this lagoon, surrounded by bamboo and frogs chirping and all these frequency interactions going on. And I'm thinking to myself, and I got to write a graduation paper for this class, right? And it's coming up. So I'm asking myself, and the reason I'm asking myself about the composition of man and the difference between energy and matter at a really heavy introspective level at this point in my path was because something was changing in my body, and I was experiencing different sensations that were foreign to me that I could not explain. scientifically. And so because of this structural integration process where I'd gone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, to learn this practice, I had been exposed to quite a bit of the work in a very short period of time. For those who know about structure work, when you first start Rolfing, I had 10 series in a very short period of time, probably within a year and a half. And that's a lot of structural stirring up in a short period of time. Well, while I'm in this state and I'm about to graduate this course, I'm staring out thinking, how am I going to discuss human energy? Because that's what I want to talk about as an electrical engineer. That's what was on my mind, in writing this paper. And there weren't many guidelines that limited your ability to choose whatever topic you wanted, which was really nice. So, and of course I wanted to relate it to what I'd just been through this course, so I chose a topic called structure, its function, and energy to try to explain where energy meets matter, and with the best understanding, scientific and pragmatic, that I had at the time. And the real thing I was focused on mostly in explaining was not so much the human energy body itself, even though I detailed it in the paper. I was really focused on truly trying to understand what gravity was at that time. Because I realized that gravity was such a significant force. We encounter it every day. Nobody really pays attention to it that much, except for trying to avert things from falling from one height to a lower height and breaking glasses. They're not really paying attention to how it's affecting their bodies. Well, structural integration was all about that. And one of the hidden magical pieces of this was all of a sudden I was having an experience that was different energetically in my body, my temple, such that when I was exposed to sunlight or water or various stimuli, I was having just a profound experience, which I had not had before, just, a short time ago. Wow. So I'm like, what's different? What's going on? And I was feeling some really amazing sensations to try to explain. So ultimately, and my quest was to understand where energy meets matter, talk about the stuff and still continue the lifestyle that I was in, especially as an engineer. So, it was still goofy information where people didn't even talk about UFOs that much. It had started though. And then, in 2009 with the Ancient Aliens on History Channel coming out and starting to broach some of this material, it started becoming a little more discussable. So
sure, it's a journey of discovery.
In general, this process that somebody goes through when they're exposed to this, and some people have assigned, labels to what they call it, and it it's kind of telling, and some people call it breaking the God spell in a way because of what was done. So
it's a profound journey of discovery, Gerald, and you see it in people when they get the knowledge and they can't deny it anymore, and then they go, and the awareness comes after that and on what it all means. It is a profound journey of discovery. I guess that's what leads us into the topics for today's show. I mean, last time we got into the Gigi, the miners, the awareness. Did they have awareness? Did they get triggered with mechanisms for ascension, or Ningishida, the geneticist, to fix the problem? These are all great questions and great explorations of the details of the legacy of what we've been left with this information. Let's get right into it, Gerald. Let's continue on that. What is the composition of man? What are we made of today? Where are we coming from? What do we know about ourselves from this history of the Anunnaki and the legacy that's been left to us?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because this chapter that we're discussing, chapter 3 out of my new book, The Seventh Planet, is really a synthesis of my pragmatic experience, where science hasn't really caught up with some of the exploratory realms, and people who are playing with higher energy through auric fields, through meditations, things like that, versus, what we could measure. So I think both of those come out in this chapter, which is kind of the best we can do with where we're at least where I was at the time that I had this information. So when we talk about the composition of man, that's probably a topic that I started thinking about when I was 13 or 14, and I was in sports, right? So I was playing football, running track, and playing baseball, pretty typical sports. And I noticed that in competing on the field that there were certain athletes that were more inspired, more capable, more whatever than others, and they were the stars, right? And so, being any typical kid is like, well, it's like looking at an animal that has a capability that you don't have. Go, well, what do I have to do to be able to operate that way? So, I started looking at people on the chessboard of life more in terms of these entities that had certain energy, and usually where there was this bigger than life energy, there was a being who had, yes, a big ego, but oftentimes just an auric field that was overwhelming. They'd light up a room they walk in. And then I started thinking to myself about this: what is the place where energy and matter intersect, and how do we characterize this? And it was a question I was asking myself as a young athlete, and I never really quite got an answer, but that was still in the background of my mind when I was thinking about the composition of man. Mm-hmm. And this came to a head for me, this distinction between energy and matter, when I was just graduating from my structural integration training